This meeting of the State Water Infrastructure Authority to order. Our meeting today will be over 2 days since we have a full agenda. And we have a full room today as well, which is fantastic. We have authority members who couldn't join us in person, but are with us online. But we'll try to keep an eye on online to see if any authority members have raised hands or trying to signal that they'd like to speak. But if you're online and you're an authority member, once we get into discussions, it might just be easier to unmute yourself and just insert your comments at an opportune time. If you plan to leave the meeting early, please let Susan know in the chat for record. We're using 2 Bluetooth speakers in the room. As a reminder, these are always on. There's one by the presentation laptop and one here. It should pick up any conversations, including any side conversations. So just keep that in mind as well, because we want to make sure the authority members online are able to hear the discussions. And while this meeting is being broadcast online, members of the public are on mute. SWIA meetings have a specific time reserved on the agenda for informal comments from the public, for which signups are needed. Signups are were requested by 5 o'clock yesterday. I don't think we had anybody sign up yesterday, but for those in the room, welcome to sign up for informal public comments, which is at the end of the agenda tomorrow. Audience members online who are listening in, just please remember not to use the chat function. It's we're not monitoring the chat to be able to respond to the public. Again, the public comments come in the informal comments section. On the agenda today, we have a few action items, and we should consider potential conflicts of interest. State Government Ethics Act, North Carolina General Statute 138A mandates that the chair inquire as to whether there are any known or potential conflicts of interest with respect to any matter before the authority members today or tomorrow. If any member has any known conflicts or potential conflict of interest, let me know now, or please bring those up when we start that agenda item. Are there any known or potential conflicts of interest anybody would like to announce at this time? Okay, thank you. We have a long agenda for today. We're going all day through to about 4:30 or so, and there is a lunch break. We will try to follow the agenda timing as much as possible, but given some of the agenda items and discussions that we expect for some of them, it might be difficult. So anytime we need a break or we need to change the agenda, feel free to suggest it, make a motion, or I'll just try to monitor and try to keep us on track. Let's take roll call. We'll start with those online so we can check the audio as well. Melody?
Present.
Thank you, Melody. Johan?
Present.
Thank you, John. Your volume is a little bit low, but we heard you. I'm going to turn up the volume here. Leela?
Present.
Thank you, Leela. And those are the only ones I see online. In the room, Bill? Present. Thank you. Maria? Bernadette?
Here.
Thank you. And for the record, Sharon and Ed are both not present and will not be joining us today. And so we do have enough for a quorum. Thank you. Next slide, please. So first thing on the agenda is approval of the meeting minutes from the April SWIA meeting. The meetings have been provided to the authority members. Were there any questions or discussions or any edits that you'd like to propose, or would somebody like to present a motion to approve the minutes?
Move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Maria. Maria made the motion to approve. Do we have a second? Yes. Bill seconds. We'll take votes. So Bernadette?
Approve.
Thank you. Melody?
Aye.
Johan?
Aye.
Leela?
Aye.
Thank you. And Bill, you're aye as well. Thank you. This motion carries. Thank you. Next slides. Next item on the agenda is the Attorney General's office reports.
I have
Mary
nothing
Lou.
to report.
Nothing to report. Thank you, Mary. All right, chair's remarks. So first, I'd like to congratulate Bernadette, who's been reappointed to the authority for another 2-year term. Welcome. I'm glad that you're with us and continue to serve on the Stormwater Funding Committee as well. This past funding rounds, so we're going to be taking action on the spring 2023 funding round as well. The past funding round was much smaller compared to the last two that we had gone through, but demand is still very, very high for these funds. Not only that, but we're also on the cusp of funding a specific for lead service line emerging contaminants that's new to the state and to our programs. And these are all on the agenda for this meeting today and tomorrow. So we'll save a discussion for that. But I just wanted to take this time to appreciate the staff's tremendous efforts in building new funding programs at the same time that we're handling record number of projects. As a reminder, last two funding rounds, SWIA awarded more than 4 times the amount of funding that the authority normally awards on a normal year. In addition, on top of that, the division is also administering an equal number of funds that was directly appropriated. So the workload has multiplied. So I really appreciate all the work that the division staff and division staff has been putting into all of these projects. On that note, the division and department continue to monitor the resources and needs to administer the funds and the projects. Supervisors across the division have been meeting internally to identify high priority areas to reorganize the division in order to be able to accomplish our mission. We've already implemented significant changes, especially by adding nearly 36 employees in the past few months. We're implementing new processes to expedite our work, such as taking applications online, as opposed to doing them by paper, for instance. This is all thanks to everybody who's on the division staff and the supervisors, and for our partners across the departments for thinking creatively and being willing to implement new processes. I also want to thank Deputy Director Stephanie, who's somewhere around here, thank you, who hit the ground running. She just joined us in January, but hit the ground running and is taking lead in organizing the division-wide work and addressing the division's needs, so thank you. And then last but not least, in any way, I also want to thank John Risgard for all the work that he's put into funding programs on the division side. As section chief, John helped orient and mentor me on DEQ in the division, along with other people who have been mentoring me as well. John's been section chief for, I don't know how many years, several years now. About 4 years now, and he's been running the SRF units. He's also chaired the SWIA meetings in between division directors. For personal reasons, John is stepping down from the section chief role, but not leaving the division. He continues to work in the division. So he also told me to keep this short. So I just want to say thank you to John for everything that you've done as a section chief, and we're going to keep you busy and keep you coming to the SWIA meetings, I think, in your new role as well.
All right, perfect.
Thank you. All right, next slide. All right, so first agenda item, or the next agenda item is approval of an increase to clean water SRF funding for Johnson County, and John will present.
All right, thank you, Shadi. Seems like we've been doing this a little bit more than normal, at least in my 4 years. But we have another really good project for you to consider awarding additional funds for. Johnston County wastewater treatment plant expansion. I'll give you some background on the project, the summary of where they are at funding and in construction of the project, and then make our recommendations to you for an action. So the Johnson County Regional Wastewater Treatment Facility. Sorry. Okay. Is currently located in the Neuse River floodway and has experienced flooding events. And they've, for quite some time now, been looking for alternatives or a way to make sure that that treatment plant is protected from flooding and have a long-term resiliency plan in place. As part of their alternative analysis, they looked at expanding in raising protective dikes and raising the infrastructure on site. That was not practical economically because of environmental impacts and just the costs of doing that fortification. So the county has a project in place to construct a new treatment facility at the site of their existing biosolids facility adjacent to the county's landfill. That project has received funding multiple times. They've actually been considered for funding in 9 funding rounds since 2016 and have been awarded funds 5 different times by the authority for a total of, big number, $83 million and some more in repayable loan. That project, November 2021, we approved their first authorization to award for one of 3 contracts. It's referred to as the 2010 wastewater treatment plant contract to begin construction. December 2021, the county came back to the division and requested additional funds. They were under the impression that the division could approve up to 10% of the funds awarded and thus requested $8.3 million of additional funds. This would allow them to continue to fully fund the project as bids were coming in. Of course, costs have gone up since 2016, and they've been responding to that. The project currently is funded both with SRF loan and county funds. We'll get into that a little bit in the future in the presentation. And they've been requesting funds continuously to try to make sure they can maximize the SRF loan amount and use some of the other county funds for other projects. They made the request during the fall 2021 funding round. So the division decided to put that on hold. Let's get through that funding round and allow the county to continue to update costs. And then the plan was to come to the authority with that request for additional funds. Fortunately, that never happened for various reasons. That never became an agenda item, and we never brought that to you for consideration. In January of 2022, the division authorized construction authorization to award contract number 2 to start biosolids facility. At that time, the division mistakenly included loan closing costs that included the pending not yet approved loan increase. We were providing them additional information authority to award. It included the updated numbers that should not have been included but were. The county has paid the full closing fee and at that time was under the impression that the loan of over $91.5 million had been secured. November of that year, between November and January of 2022-2023, the third and final contract bids were received, notice to proceed were given, and all 3 contracts are now in place under construction with a completion date expected of August 2024. Part of the staff report includes the county's ordinance, their capital project ordinance for the project, and that ordinance just further supports the county's understanding that that loan had been in place of $91.6 million, and it shows the allocation of other funds from the county. It's a mixture of some ARPA, local fiscal recovery funds from ARPA, as well as I think just regular capital utility funds. Their plan is to secure as much SRF loan as they can for this project, and then to use their ARPA local fiscal recovery funds for other projects in the county. That capital project ordinance also supports that the county is planning on and continues to plan on applying for additional SRF loans. They were considered in both spring and fall of last year, neither of which scored high enough to receive funds. And considering the huge amount of demand for the ARPA funds, it was extremely competitive, and the project was not selected for funding. And then for transparency, they have a project considered for later this afternoon for this round. That project is also not in the funding range. got ahead of myself and covered all this stuff already. So kind of to summarize where we're at, division has inadvertently provided county with documentation of a loan increase of $8.3 million prior to bringing the request to SWIA. The county continued project design and construction in good faith and has fully cooperated with the division in unwinding the project history and looked at reasonable solutions to assure that funds are available for the project. Want to remind the authority that the project is under construction. All contracts are in place. And certainly could be increased costs through change order, but the project is moving along with $8.3 million short of funding. Does not match with the ordinance that is in place. Additional funding. This additional funding would not and does not reduce the amount of clean water SRF funds available for this funding round, which is important. Typically, if we would not, staff would not approve an increase that would impact future funding rounds or current funding rounds. This would not. Johnson County requests an additional $8,335,154 of SRF loan funding the project. And it's the division and the authority's understanding that the division will bring all funding increases in excess of $5 million to the authority for approval. Any request of less than that, we do have the authority to approve if funds are available, and it will not impact future funding. So staff recommends that the authority approves the additional funds of Clean Water SRF repayable loan to Johnston County's wastewater treatment facility, 4 million gallon per day expansion project to fully meet their capital project ordinance and budget. Thank you.
All right, any questions or discussion? Looking online as well for any hands raised or anybody unmuting themselves. Not seeing any. Okay, so if no questions, we can entertain a motion. You can see the recommendation on the screen.
I'll move that we provide additional funding as staff recommends for Johnson County.
Thank you, Bernadette. Bernadette makes a motion to approve the additional funding. Do we have a second?
This is Leila. I'll second.
Okay, Leila seconds. Thank you, Leila. Another chance for a discussion or any questions? Okay.
So just a quick question. So on the slide, it says it's a 4 million gallon per day expansion project. So is it an expansion of an existing or is it building new?
It's building a brand new treatment plant at the new location.
Okay. Okay, because that is maybe a bit confusing that it says expansion. Expansion might lead one to believe that it's of the existing facility.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I understand.
I think we use that term when we talk about even building new infrastructure that provides additional capacity.
Yes, this particular example, that's their name of the project on it as a line.
Any other questions or discussion? All right, well, we had the motion and the second, so we'll go around the room for votes. Bill? Thank you. Maria? Leila, you made the second.
Aye.
Thank you. Juhan?
Aye.
And Melody?
Aye.
Thank you all. Appreciate that. So the motion carries. And I'm sure Johnson County and we also really appreciate it. Make sure the project moves forward. Thank you, John. Next agenda item. We're going to start getting into the spring 2023 funding rounds now. And we'll start with CDBG, followed by drinking water, wastewater, followed by the stormwater funding rounds. So this agenda items, the CDBG funding being presented by Colleen Simmons. Colleen.
All right, good morning. I apologize if I lose my voice or I have to stop and take a drink. I'm dealing with a head cold today. All right, so in your packet, you have our staff report. of our detailing our application intake. With that staff report, we also have two attachments. They're attachment 1 or F1 and F2. They are the spreadsheets that go along with the staff report. The first spreadsheet you should see is the project information spreadsheet. This provides information on all the eligible projects. The projects in the funding scenario that I'll later present are highlighted in blue. Second table identifies 2 projects that were deemed ineligible. I can go into that later on. And then our other spreadsheet we have is our funding scenario spreadsheet. That contains the example funding scenario for you guys to consider. The projects in this funding scenario are highlighted in blue. And then if example of funding from different funding sources are also provided in blue as well. The summary of our intake, we received in 12 applications on May 1st or 2nd, can't remember the date. 5 were for drinking water, 7 were for wastewater. We had 2 incomplete or ineligible projects, and it fell into one was drinking water and one was a wastewater project. Remove those 2. We had 10 complete eligible projects to present to you guys. 4 was under drinking water, and then 6 were for wastewater projects. As you can see on the table, we have between the requested, we had a little over $7 million requested for drinking water projects from the completed eligible projects only. We didn't consider for the math the incomplete applications. We had a little over 12 million requested for drinking water projects, and then for a total of over $19 million. So keep that 19 million, roughly a little over $19 million, almost 20. This slide, you guys have seen in the past. I wanted to show you where we sit as a program with our funding. Unfortunately, our 2026 or 2016, we had no current grantees needing additional funds to spend within a very short time. So I've been in discussion with the Department of Commerce, and they're going to see if they can use our balance for some of their projects, so we do not turn it over back to the U.S. government in September. Our 2017 pot, it actually is less than that right now. We have right now we have on the screen, it says 662,000 and some, but I have 2 grantees that have went out to bid, and they've did value added, they've negotiated with the low bidder, they've reduced scope, and they are still over budget. So they requested officially last week, and last week, both of them came in. One's asking for another $500,000, and one's asking for a little over $150,000. So that pot of money for the 17 is down to like 12,000 right now. So that's great. We still have about a handful of projects still going out for construction. So I envision that some of them will come in and ask for the 18 pot maybe, or the 19. So we're not touching any of those older monies today. We're going to concentrate on allocating the full 14,723,243,000 of the 22 money. But I wanted to present you this so you understood where we sat overall, since we talked about this previously. So, all right. So this slide talks about, again, we have 10 complete full application for consideration, 4 for drinking water, 6 for waste, with a breakdown of what they requested. As you can tell, they requested more money than what we have available under the 2022. So not everyone's going to get funded. All right, so F2, this slide correlates with your handout for F2. It doesn't go into all the detail that's on your spreadsheet because the slide's not that big. But there's 7 applications that staff, after review and consideration and discussion, are recommending for award. Town of Brunswick, you guys awarded them $1 million in February. They took their application, tweaked it, and they came back with it, and they're our highest scoring application that was completed. They're asking for $2 million. Magnolia, they currently just finished up a construction project with us, so They're asking for additional money to do some more work for less than 1.5 million. Warsaw, they're done with construction as well on their existing project with us, so they're just asking for some more money to do some more work for another water treatment improvements for 3 million. Fountain, they've been our grantee with us in the past. They haven't been in our program in about 4 years, I think. So they got successful again. So they want a little bit over 2 million. Bear Bluff, they were also a grantee with us in the past. I think they were one of the originals in our program. They're asking for 3 million to do some gravity sewer in a section of town that's desperately needed. Haver City actually just got done with their construction on their current project with us, so they're rolling in and trying to get some more for sewer. And then Waynesville, our solo town over in the west side of the state, they came in with a drinking water project and a wastewater project. Their sewer project or wastewater projects were the best. So we're asking you to do a partial funding to wipe out the rest of the 22 money. I've already been in discussions with them about how they can apply in the fall for the remaining work. Is there any questions before I go on? Okay.
Ollie?
All right, I have a little mouse here. Yes, there was, let me check my notes. There was at least 5 applications that we received in that John's groups also received in. None of the ones that we are funding, proposed to fund, are funded by him, or the ones that are funded by him are at the very bottom of our list. So there's no cross population of funding for any of ours.
Ollie, question about Waynesville.
Yes.
So if that's being partially funded, what do they need to apply for the rest of the funding, or can they be considered for any of the older money that's being unobligated or not? Yeah.
That was a discussion, and with knowing that we have a handful of projects still going out for construction in this market right now, we wanted to conserve our old money in case those existing projects needed a little bit more to finish construction. So Waynesville understands that they'll get a little over $1 million to do a group of work, and they're already working on trying to split out components to tackle the 1 million potential award, and then they'll come in with the remaining work under a new application.
Okay.
And they understand that just because they do that doesn't mean they guarantee by February that it'll be a successful application, but they're willing to gamble. And
But a year or two from now, if they're in construction and we have older money that's about to be unobligated, they would be considered for those, or they'd have to get an award?
they would have to get an award.
Okay.
Just like Brunswick had to do. Brunswick came in the last round, excuse me, and we deemed some of it was ineligible or based on our guidance at the time. So the authority gave them $1 million to do some of the work. They reworked it, and we actually, staff reworked some of our guidance because what they're awarding, what you potentially award is for replacing water tanks because they're undersized to meet the current design standards. So our regs, our guidance at the past did not allow that to happen. Now it does. So they're able to come in and request those tanks to get replaced up to the current standard. Because in our eyes, previously those tanks were an expansion. Our program doesn't pay for expansions. Any other questions?
I don't know if I looked up, and it's probably asked again, I don't remember, but it has down that there would be 43 new connections at about 55,000 per connection. So, and then just a brief narrative here doesn't talk about adding on new customers. So what happens with, given the 1 million, are there new connections? Or
They are
not.
They are, that's some clarification we need to have with the town. Their application, their service, this project and their drinking water application, they were servicing an area that had private systems. They had a communal system. And so it'd be a new public connection, but the infrastructure is already there. So we got to get more clarification on what is truly a new connection, what versus what's just a a reconnection to their system. Yeah, we had a lot of those questions too when we were reviewing that application. It's like, what are they truly saying here?
So these are not purely extensions and connecting new, maybe not all connecting new homes, but there's some also replacing of aging infrastructure.
Yes,
So that number, the dollars per connection might be inflated because some of it is just replacement of pipes instead of connections.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be, if they do get awarded, that's gonna be part of their award letter is, more clarification on what they're truly, gonna do.
Any questions online? Don't see anything. All right, Colleen.
Okay, staff is recommending the authority to fully fund applications numbers 1 through 6 and partially fund application 7.
Thank you. And we can take a single motion or break them up into two if you want. Do you have a motion or any questions? You're all being very thoughtful.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Burnett. What's your motion?
The motion is to fully fund applications 1 through 6 and partially fund application number 7 as recommended by staff.
Thank you, Burnett. So we have a motion to approve 1 through 6 and partially fund number 7. Do we have a second?
John seconds.
All right, we'll give it to Johan. Johan seconds. Thank you. And any questions for about any of these projects? All right, we'll take votes then. Bill?
Aye.
Thank you. Maria?
Aye.
Melody? Melody?
Aye.
Thank you. Johan?
Aye.
Thank you. And Leela?
Aye.
Thank you all. That motion carries. Thank you, Colleen. All right, next on the agenda is, I think we're ahead of schedule, which is good. For the moment, discussion of the drinking water and the wastewater application rounds, and John is presenting. I think we have two back-to-back agenda items. We had scheduled it so that the discussion happens, or this agenda item happens first, and then we would, I think we were supposed to go break for lunch before coming back for, well, we are ahead of schedule, so we might need to revisit that on the agenda. So let's see how the discussion goes. Let's go with this agenda item. John.
All right, thanks, Shadi. So spring 2023 application round for SRF funds, some other funds, non-CDBGI. Shadi and I were talking earlier this week, maybe last week, about how this seemed like such a straightforward application round compared to the last year and a half, 2 years worth of ARPA funds and other complicated rounds, CYDRA funds 2 years ago. And that just made me more nervous that something's going to come up or we're going to have, we may have missed something, though I'm confident we didn't miss anything. So this funding round is considering the state revolving funds. That's both clean water and drinking water SRF-based funds. It also includes consideration for some additional bipartisan infrastructure law that supplemented the SRF funds. It's a little bit more than what we may have had in the past. These funds are all loan funds with some principal forgiveness allowances. You'll notice that the principal forgiveness amounts are higher than previous rounds. The bipartisan infrastructure law had a higher goal of the amount of principal forgiveness or additional subsidy to be provided. We also have some state reserve funds. In the last 2 rounds, almost all of the state reserve funds awarded were ARPA funds. These are not ARPA funds. These are a little bit left over, I guess, of the $10 million annual appropriations that the department receives that we've done historically for the last couple of years. We decided last round to hold some of that to try to better use those limited funds. Talk about that later in the presentation. So this, well, I'm going to back up quick. So staff report has in much more detail all the information that I'm going to provide, as well as the tables. It's the same format of the tables that Colleen went over for the CDBGI program. All of the tables in the presentation are also in the staff report, plus some additional ones. So this first table is a summary of the amount of funds that were made available for this round. The majority of it in the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF program. Like I said, a little bit of state reserves, $6.67 million. And then the CDBGI funds that Colleen has already talked about. And some local assistance for stormwater infrastructure. I can't remember what the other I's for. Funds, those are ARPA funds for stormwater projects. And Tony will be talking about that later today. I think it's the next agenda item. So a total of $222.7 million total for today. I'll be just talking about a portion of that, but SRF funds and the state reserve funds. What did we get application wise? Shadi said we didn't get that many. We still got plenty.
They said it was still a high demand.
So this figure shows the number of complete and eligible application, and it includes reconsiderations. And we had a lot of unfunded projects, unfortunately, in the last round that were carried over to this round. Those reviews are much more streamlined than a brand new application to review, but it still does take staff time to do that. So don't feel too bad for this. 338 total applications considered. That does include the stormwater applications that Tony's going to talk about later. $2.676 billion of requested funds, which is significantly greater than $222 million. So the amount requested and the need for funding still greatly outweighs the amount of funds that we have available to provide. Fairly even distribution in requests. I would say historically, our programs received more requests for funding for wastewater projects. Not the case for this round, slightly more on the drinking water side, although the total requested funding for the two programs is roughly the same statistically, probably. Okay, a little bit of data, a little visualization on the types of applications that we received, and getting ahead of myself a little bit as well, because it does show in the darker blue the applications in the funding scenario, but let's focus on the lighter blue and the longer bars on this figure. It shows the distribution of applications that we received and the types of applications that we're getting for drinking water projects. I think it's 159, got ahead of myself, total applications, eligible applications received. Just kind of looking at the different lengths of the bars on the figure. We are getting a lot of applications from communities less than 10,000 residential connections. That's most of the systems anyways, but glad to see that it's the smaller systems that are requesting funds. Majority of them have high rates, and the majority of them have 3 or more LGU indicators. So to me, this is a strong indication of the communities most in need of funding assistance are requesting funds through the programs, which that's great targeting. Looks like we're targeting the right audience and getting applications from them. Old infrastructure, about the 5th line down, also is we're seeing a lot of applications for systems trying to deal with old infrastructure. It's great. Those are all good projects. They're all good projects. Distressed communities is the first one under the total. A fair amount, 50 some applications, 58, wasn't that many, 55 maybe, from distressed systems. So we're continuing to get interest from those communities that have been designated as distressed. Great. One that you specifically asked for, I don't think I have the numbers, but the project applications that are resulting from AIAs and MRFs. We are tracking that, and you can see that we're getting some less than 20 of the total. And that's a data point where they're self-identifying that the project has come from an AIA
And this is, and keep in mind that we've only been having AIs and MRFs just relatively recently. We've been funding a whole lot more. Everybody's working on those. This is a result of previous, so a smaller number of AIs and MRFs.
Switching to the same idea for wastewater, 144.
100. So John, those numbers
Oh, yeah,
included
that's right.
CDBG. It's 138.
38, thank you.
For this one.
Kind of a similar observations, majority of the applications are coming from smaller communities. They have high rates, 3 or more LGU indicators for the affordability criteria. We're getting a good amount of projects that are claiming that they are benefiting a disadvantaged area. So that seems to be of interest to the communities, that they're trying to find projects or identifying their projects as providing a service to a disadvantaged area. Those projects are eligible for additional prioritization and can get principal forgiveness if the community doesn't meet the affordability criteria. Questions on that before I move on? I think it's pretty interesting data. So I'll go back. See if there's any questions here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Leela?
this is Leila. I think it's, okay, I'm just the difference between service to disadvantaged areas and benefits to disadvantaged areas. And you may have hit on that, and
Oh, yes. So the service to disadvantages those are projects that are providing new water or wastewater services to disadvantaged areas that are not currently connected to the utility. So that's a much smaller subset. The benefit to disadvantaged area, that is just the project is in a disadvantaged area and provides a direct benefit to that service area. So that, for example, that could be upgrading pump stations that are experiencing SSOs in a disadvantaged area, doing line work, either water or wastewater of old infrastructure where they can show that it's providing a benefit to that service area.
okay, thank you.
Yep. And just to also clarify with the service disadvantaged areas, these may be slightly underreporting because if a project is to replace failing infrastructure in a disadvantaged area by providing connections, which we can consider to be service to disadvantaged areas, they may be claiming failing infrastructure points instead. So they're in one or the other. The failing infrastructure may include service in disadvantaged areas. So that bar that you see for service disadvantaged area might be a little bit less than what it actually is.
Thank you, Shadi. And there's a table in the staff report that actually has some of these numbers that correspond exactly. Easier to see visually.
It's interesting to see that we got a lot of applications, not a lot, but we got applications for emerging contaminants in the drinking water side. This is before we have dedicated funding for emerging contaminants. We've also seen it in the previous round too, that lots of applications or utilities are putting in applications and trying to deal with emerging contaminants as well.
Okay, so what is the methodology that staff uses for making recommendations? As always, we try to provide the best available funds to the highest priority rating projects. Staff look at 100% state grant or state reserve funded project as the best available funds we can provide, followed by 100% principal forgiveness. Based off of funding restrictions that we have, that's hard to do. State grants is $3 million. Principal forgiveness is often limited to around 500,000. CDBGI, third best considered funding. Colleen already talked about that program in agenda item F. After that, the 100% grant or principal forgiveness types of projects becomes a blend, and that's where you see a lot more of those types of projects where it's can't fully fund it with the state reserve state grant, so it's a mix of state reserve and other loan funds, or a mix of principal forgiveness and loan. I hate that they're on the bottom of the list because those are still really good funding programs and opportunities for systems. And SRF, 100% SRF loan, of course, we feel that's a great program with the low interest rates that are provided and should never be at the bottom. So some of the rules of the funds, I guess, the limitations. The state reserve by statute is $3 million per recipient every 3 years. If you remember, ARPA funds came through the state reserve as well. That $3 million limit did not apply, but we are back to that $3 million limitation for state reserve funds, that $10 million annual appropriation. Some of the limits for the state revolving fund, interest rates. We use half of the market interest rate, which makes it a very good competitive interest rate for communities. There is an ability to get reduced interest rates for communities that meet the affordability criteria and have project purpose points. They can get a 1% interest rate reduction or 0% interest rate, depending on their percentage of grant principal forgiveness eligibility. And green projects, they also receive, if selected for our Green Project Reserve, a 1% interest rate reduction. Loan limits, $25 million per funding round for drinking water SRF project, $35 million for clean water SRF projects, and then there's a 200 total indebtedness for a recipient. That 25 million and $35 million, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. I'm going to be, as I get into the funding scenario and some projects of kind of how we recently increased that from 20 to 25, 30 to 35, and what the impacts are or are not to this funding round. Talk about that later. Okay, grant principal forgiveness, grant principal forgiveness. You've heard all this before. I'll go over it again just so you're mindful of it. Grant principal forgiveness eligibility is determined 2 ways. We look at the affordability criteria, and we look at whether or not projects are benefiting a disadvantaged area. Benefiting disadvantaged area is a newer thing. It's been around at least a full year now, I believe. Affordability criteria is something the authority approves. It looks at local government unit indicators, looks at rates, looks at operating ratio, looks at the size of the community, and determines a percent eligibility, 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100%. But there is an initial cap of $500,000 of principal forgiveness. If we do not reach our principal forgiveness goal, we can go over, make recommendations greater over the $500,000 initial cap, and we did that this year, and we've done that in previous rounds. It's becoming more common because of the additional principal forgiveness goals with bipartisan infrastructure law funds. The other mechanism is projects that benefit a disadvantaged area. Once they've documented that they are benefiting the disadvantaged area, that project becomes eligible for 50% principal forgiveness, but it has that same cap of $500,000 and the same allowance to go over that if funds are available. If there are additional principal forgiveness available, those would be provided in priority order. All right, we are moving on to the funding scenario. This is just a reminder of what you have in your package, staff report with all the details. 4 different spreadsheets. We've got 2 for drinking water, 2 for wastewater. I won't spend a lot of time on this because Colleen already did. A lot of information in there as always. I will be providing information on the examples funding scenario. If you would like to see some alternate funding scenarios, we certainly can do that, but we obviously need some time, depending on when we finish this agenda item. It could be a break, or we could do it afterwards. All right, so how does the example funding scenario look? 9 drinking water projects are recommended for funding. Those projects would receive SRF funds and principal forgiveness. $85.3 million of total funding is part of the scenario. The advertised funds available was $85 million. So we've just barely went just a little bit over what was advertised as being available. For wastewater projects, 25 projects have been identified in the funding range. It's kind of the amounts of those projects and trying to best use the funds available. All of the SRP grants would be going to wastewater projects. Again, keep in mind that there's a $3 million cap with the desire to fully fund projects with those SRP grants if possible. If you blend the funds with SRF projects, all of the SRF federal conditions go with the project, and suddenly that there really isn't a huge benefit. There is no benefit to getting those funds. 6.67 million of SRP grant, another 12.6 of principal forgiveness, and $97.5 million of SRF repayable loan. 116.7 million. The advertised goal is 110. Some notes on the selected drinking water projects, 9 projects. I went over this already. There was one project that exceeds the $500,000 principal forgiveness cap. That's the city of Sanford. The way this funding round works, if there's additional principal forgiveness available, you go from the $500,000 up to their percent eligibility. And that's why they went from 500,000 to 16 million in principal forgiveness. It's a big gap. One of the potential changes to our program starting this fall would be to award the additional principal forgiveness in increments of, I think it's $1 million, 500,000 to help spread those funds out a little bit better in future rounds. That's something that's approved in the IUP. So we're following our intended use plan, and that results in the 16 million going to Sanford. 16 million of principal forgiveness, 9 million repayable loan.
And that change that John talked about in the principal forgiveness will start in the fall round of funding. So this won't be the same kind of result this time.
All right, this next slide talks a little bit about some of our, I guess, the bigger projects. These are 3 of the 9 projects will remain partially funded after this round, and that's even with going from $20 to $25 million funding caps per round. Sanford, Rocky Point Topsoil Water and Sewer Authority, and Fuquay-Varina Sanford SFF expansion projects. The Rocky Point Topsoil, they've been applying for multiple rounds and are really close to being fully funded and may be able to use local funds to get that project fully funded. We expect Sanford and Fuquay to continue to come in seeking additional funds. It's something for the authority to just kind of be thinking of as we continue to upgrade priority rating systems and intended use plans, is that balance between getting projects fully funded and funding more projects. We're seeing more and more large capital projects, even over the 100 million and maybe $200 million funding caps that we have in place. And what's the right thing to do? What should be the approach of this authority? To recognize that, hey, it's a good project and getting that fully funded, even if it is well over the funding caps per round. We're continuing to try to spread that money out to as many different projects as we can. Don't have a recommendation here, but just wanted to bring that up. Here's 3 big projects, one of which has been trying to get fully funded for quite some time, and 2 that you're going to continue to see over the probably next couple of years. Also, 69%, $59 million of the available funds is going to 3 projects for the drinking water program this round. Same 3 projects. Again, all 3 will need additional funds. So we've increased the cap. We're seeing bigger projects. We're funding less programs, less projects. Good or bad? I don't think I have an opinion right now. We're still learning. Definitely trying to balance that. Let's get these projects under construction and going versus let's help as many communities as we can.
John, I have a question. So when you say put the projects under contract and get them going, can they put the project under contract if they don't have all of the funds necessary to complete it?
We want to make sure they have all the funds lined up before we approve plans and specs and give them authorization to go to bid.
Right, that's what I thought. So, you know, just thinking out loud, spreading the funds out is, you know, worthy, but in a sense, it means that potentially all three projects don't get started versus maybe trying to target one project and get it fully funded so that it can go ahead and get completed and then move through the projects, because when we spread it out, it means that all three are waiting for additional funds versus being able to actually provide the funds that are, you know, forecasted to be needed so that those projects can get started and get done.
Yeah.
Unless I'm missing something in that equation.
No, you nailed it. I think that Johnson County project that I talked about earlier today is a great example. You know, 9 different funding rounds they've come to the authority, or provided applications for consideration. You know, that's 4.5 years worth of funding rounds where they've been trying to get funds for the project. Now Johnson County had found other funds and found ways to keep that project going. That's fantastic. Rocky Point Topsail is an example of one where, you know, they're continuing to evaluate the project and make sure that they're ready to go. But until they can get the loan funds lined up, they're not going to be able to go forward. So you raise an excellent point, and I think staff have to put some time into that and bring some options and alternatives to the authority of how can we do a better job of making sure some of these projects don't languish, trying to get all their funds lined up and not moving forward.
Great, thank you.
John, this is Leela. Can you talk a little more about the principal forgiveness and whether we have any discretion on that?
So yes, you have some discretion as in how the affordability criteria and priority rating system is approved and developed, but not a lot of discretion actually in the funding round then to move principal forgiveness around because it's set by IUP.
Okay.
Leela, but we'd love input from the authority members, because that might help in the future when we do edits. I mean, like I said, the intended use plan for this coming round changes how the additional principal forgiveness will be allocated. If there's suggestions or recommendations from the authority for staff to consider.
Well, so obviously I think it jumps out at everyone. We're giving one entity $16 million in principal forgiveness and everyone else is limited to 500,000.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's just not preferred. And what jumps out at me are two things. One is that only one of these communities are distressed. I believe Town of Plymouth.
Yes.
And they are limited to the 500,000, where someone else who's not distressed is getting 16 million. And the other is that essentially the town of Fuquay-Varina is the same project as the city of Sanford. It's just like so they're just funding their portions of the project independently, if I understand this right.
That's correct.
And so again, one entity is getting favored over the other entity and the other one's not even getting funded fully. I mean, neither of them are getting funded fully. So that just really jumps out at me. And I wish we could have prevented, we've never been in this situation before that I remember of giving. Am I correct? What's the most principal forgiveness we've given before?
I don't have those numbers, but in previous rounds, drinking water was 2 to 5 million, maybe.
Yeah, there wasn't 16 million.
right?
Yeah.
It just blows my mind.
Right.
A lot. And
The bipartisan infrastructure fund significantly increased the principal forgiveness goals. And that's why there's so much more available in these rounds. Mentioned earlier that we have made, I'll talk about it tomorrow. Actually, I don't think it's even in the slide, but some of the changes to how that principal forgiveness would be distributed. Providing it in $500,000 increments in priority order instead of jumping immediately to that percent eligibility. That'll spread that principal forgiveness out, or should spread it out significantly. I think a better example is the wastewater, in the wastewater scenario than in the drinking water scenario, just because there's so few projects that are being funded this round, only 9.
I could just add on to what John was saying, that the change again for the fall round going forwards, Leela, would mean that if you're looking at the drinking water one, there are only 4 that were eligible for principal forgiveness. And it wouldn't be that Sanford would get all of the additional funds up to their percent eligibility. They get another 500,000. Then we drop down to Cumberland County, give them another 500,000 up to their eligibility. Then we go to Spring Hope, give them 500,000 up to their eligibility, and keep going up and down that way. So that way the principal forgiveness is being spread out more. But it is limited. It's limited to those that are eligible for principal forgiveness.
oh, right. Okay.
There are only 4 projects that are eligible for principal forgiveness in the funding range. So they would share that principal forgiveness that's available in that funding round.
And the last point I wanted to make there was, all of our distressed communities automatically get a gateway into the affordability criteria for consideration, but they are different things. The affordability calculator looks at the 5 LGU indicators, looks at population number of connections, rates, and operating ratio. And all the communities in North Carolina use that same tool to see if they're eligible for the principal forgiveness or not. So there are communities that aren't distressed eligible for principal forgiveness by design.
Gotcha. And I guess my last question on this is, I know you kind of answered the whether we have any discretion, but are we tied? Is the principal forgiveness tied to this round? Is there any possible way we can make decisions about the amount of principal forgiveness on this round in the fall?
In the fall?
Is there any way to adjust this later or to delay the principal forgiveness portion of the approval? Because I do think at least to me, this takes me by surprise that we are giving that much principal forgiveness to one entity. Because we've never.
So we're operating under the intended use plan that was already approved for fiscal year 22 funding SRF, which is where this money is coming from. 22, right? Yes, 22.
Yeah.
And the principal forgiveness methodology is laid out in their intended use plan. I don't know if I'm not sure if you're proposing we delay making awards to the fall rounds.
No, I'm just trying to reacquaint myself with all of the various rules. So when we do the next round of funding, it's going to be for the next year's intended use plan. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, so it's tied to where the year the funding came from, and this is okay. I understand.
Yeah, roughly, yes. And any decrease in principal forgiveness awarded would really want to then increase the loan amount to maximize the award. And that would impact projects lower on the list. This particular case, that's Fuquay, the same project, but their loan amount would decrease. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I just have one last question on principal forgiveness, just as, not to seem ignorant, but, uh, so over the course of the loan, then the local government would only be expected to pay interest in a principal forgiveness scenario. Is that correct?
So the funds are provided based off of the ratio, the percent eligibility. So if it's a 25% principal forgiveness eligible project, and they have $1 million pay request, they would get 75% as repayable loan, 25% as principal forgiveness. When we're ready to amortize the loan, that's the amount that the loan portion they have to pay back at the approved interest rate. The rest they don't.
Okay.
So
So
no,
they don't
yeah,
even pay interest on the principal forgiveness portion of the loan. Is that correct?
Correct.
correct. They'll pay the fee for the loan, including the principal forgiveness portion, but they don't pay interest or repay the portion that is principal forgiveness. It looks like a grant to them at the end.
Okay, that was sort of the point I was getting at. Is this really technically a grant? So that's a good, thank you for that clarification. And then just one last question about the loans. What is the typical period of these loans?
20 year.
Both the principal forgiveness and the standard loans. What is the period?
Yeah, 20-year loan term. We can go greater than that for certain projects that meet affordability criteria, and the project life is greater than 20 years. We can't have a loan term greater than the project life, expected life of the project.
And that's great because I just visited a community that is still repaying their 40-year USDA loan. They still owe 16 years on it, and for a wastewater treatment plant, and they're getting ready to build a new one. And so they're going to pay for additional 16 years on the old water treatment plant, but abandon it for a new water treatment plant because it was cheaper than refurbishing the one they had the loan on. So
any project trying to go over 30 years, we require their consultant to show life expectancy of the entire project, and then they prorate it to figure out an expected age, expected life of the project. And we want it.
And I think I would wonder, how many units are in that same scenario where they are going to pay for extended additional periods of time on systems that are completely obsolete. And is there anything we can do as an authority to advocate for some easing or some forgiveness on those loans that potentially never should have been made for 40 years in the first place? And I think that was one of the questions that came out of this particular meeting is, what can we do potentially to help with that scenario? And how many units are out there? And this is a distressed unit. So it could be a pretty big problem.
Yeah, that was one of the concepts that were discussed. Development of the viable utility program is ability to use viable utility reserve to help pay some of those debts. The concept was to reset the utility and just get them in a better financial situation. Recognizing that sometimes that's the solution, or that's the first step to get them on the road to viability. And that you don't necessarily have to go in and build a whole bunch of new capital projects and new things. It's more of a financial reset.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, Melody, of but I guess I would presume that the loan shouldn't have been made because at the time that was probably the best technology, and it isn't necessarily that it didn't last 40 years. It's that now there's new technology or there's new whatever that makes it more. So it's kind of like you can never look back, and that's sunk cost. And there's plenty of times in infrastructure where you have to forget about your sunk costs and making a decision about what's the best thing going forward. And so I think, but it is a reminder that the longer you finance things, the more likely you might be to be in a case where you just have to give up on that cost at some point because of technology changes or construction cost decreases or whatever the case may be, that the longer the loan is to make it affordable for the community, you might be facing that kind of decision making. You might be more likely to have to face that case.
Right. But even now, we're recognizing that anything over 30, there has to be a really strong justification for. So, yeah, and it was I think a fairly typical funding scenario back, 25 years ago. So, but you're right. You do have to make that decision whether you're going to abandon your sunk cost and just keep paying it and move to a different technology. And I think we would probably, in a lot of cases, agree that many of our distressed units are potentially in that same scenario. Maybe simply for the fact that the plants just weren't maintained well. Maybe they could have lasted 40 years, but for a lot of the reasons that we see, that our distressed units have not had the best maintenance and upkeep records, can add to that situation that these local governments find themselves in. And it doesn't relieve them of the cost burden. So, just putting it out there, is there anything we can do as an organization to advocate for these units that find themselves in that situation to be relieved of those obligations?
Melody, those are really great points. I think just a couple of clarifications again for our funding programs. We don't do 40-year loans. We don't even do, rare that we do 30. It's 20 years is our maturity. And if they need more than 20, that's when we ask for additional ones.
Well, they have to have met affordability. There's statutory limitations of when we can go over 20. I might get it wrong, but it looks at whether or not they meet affordability criteria.
It's targeted interest rate one.
Target interest rate.
Thank you. The 40-year loans are other agencies, and we don't have authority over other federal programs that, like, if it's USDA funding or EDA, but EDA is not low funding, but we, as an authority, we don't really have a lot of authority to. We try to coordinate and work with USDA, but it's not. And I'm not just picking on USDA, other funding programs that's not within the purview of the Water Infrastructure Fund, which is what SWIA manages. But
right, and I understand that, and I do acknowledge the 20-year loans from SWIA, but we do have relationships with secretaries and at both the federal and state level for some advocacy, certainly not in any way suggesting that we would unilaterally have authority for any of that. But there certainly is room for discussion about, especially coming from the state's premier water and wastewater funding organization, that's a real issue that is negatively impacting probably many of our most distressed utilities.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And we can try to do as much as we can with the funds that we have and with the partnerships that we have with other agencies, like you're suggesting, Melody. An example is when ARPA funds came out, you all have approved some ARPA funds to go to projects that were about to go into loans. We replaced what would have been a loan with an ARPA grant to help prevent that situation for some of the distressed communities. So that was an example of something that you all had done to try to get ahead of this. ARPA, we couldn't use ARPA to pay off debt. That was one of the requirements from the federal government. So ARPA can't be used to actually pay debt, even though we got a lot of those questions from a lot of communities because of the situation that you're describing. So there are some limitations of what we can do, but I think that your point is clear that we should be thinking about what can we do to help alleviate some of that debt burden as much as we can. What are the options that's available for SWIA? So that's something I'll put down for maybe a future discussion point.
And I'm gonna pile on that a little bit more because I do think the point about advocacy is one. And I know one of our topics is our annual report, because potentially the funds we might have available to help, essentially looking at part of the viability solution might be debt restructuring of some sort, or basically looking at the big picture. What's the most cost-effective way to get from here to there? And the state funding might be where there's opportunity to do that.
All right, thank you.
I mean, even federally, I mean, I can't imagine that, you know, with the amount of ARPA funding that's gone out, and the emphasis on infrastructure and the need for infrastructure, that really anyone is sitting around saying, you know, while on one hand we're giving out hundreds of billions of dollars in grants for infrastructure, that we really need to be collecting on 40-year loans from some of the most distressed units of local government, not just in North Carolina, but you know, across the whole United States. So it's a little bit hard to rationalize that. So, you know, is there anybody thinking about and talking about how can we balance that so that we're alleviating both problems?
Your point is it's a great one, and yes, we've had discussions internally and we've had discussions with local governments on this. When the rules come out and they're clear that you can't use one source of funding for a specific purpose, that's what we have to communicate. But
Oh, absolutely. I understand that completely. I
Yeah.
understand that you can't.
I'd like to put that on the
Loud and
agenda
clear.
for a discussion for a future SWIA meeting. Because I think that's, it requires us to kind of do a little bit more research and coordination with other agencies to come together and come back to SWIA, maybe even have a presentation. Would that be okay?
That would be great. I think that would be great. Thank you.
All right,
Any other-
continuing on with the prepared notes, drinking water project information related to distressed communities. A good amount of the applications, about 34% of drinking water applications were from the distressed communities, distressed systems. Just the way the funding scenarios work based on prioritization, only one of the 9 potentially funded projects is from a distressed local government unit. We received 4 applications for from Robersonville, one or community that's been taken over by the local government commission. None of those 4 projects were recommended for funding. And if my memory serves me right, 2 of those are reconsiderations, 2 of those were brand new applications.
And so Robersonville, what happens with Robersonville that's been taken over by the LGC? It seems like in at least one of the applications we received for an LGC community was written by the LGC. And I don't remember who wrote this one, but what happens with Robersonville? They've been taken over and now they're not going to get the money they need for what would assume is a fairly important project for the LGC to allow them, you know, to undertake some sort of an infrastructure project.
So yes, absolutely. You know, the Viable Utility Reserve Program probably is a better fit for Robersonville and other communities taken over by local government commission, where they just don't have debt capacity. So hopefully we'll continue to get funds to support that program. The competitiveness for the principal forgiveness is still really high. I recognize that a lot of it went to a single project this round. But in the competitive SRF funding program, it's going to continue to be difficult for any community, whether they're taken over by local government commission or not, to get high enough priority to be fully funded with principal forgiveness. Unless that community truly is non-viable and they're trying to get out of the water wastewater business and have a partnership lined up. I feel that still is a good prioritization and a good approach, to make sure that these communities kind of have gone through the assessment process, have a plan for viability before they're coming to the authority for funds. Not saying that Robersonville hasn't done that, but there are other funding programs in place that hopefully can meet their needs.
And Melody, the same situation happened again last funding round too with Eureka and some other examples too. We have that discussion. And we're working with LGC right now on those applications. Robersonville is the only one of the D1 LGUs that applied for any funding this spring rounds, all drinking water. There were SCADA projects and meter replacement projects. We've already started discussions with the Viable Utility Committee to address this situation, to talk about how to prioritize funding for distressed units, especially those that are under local government control, how to do that differently. And we have an upcoming Viable Utilities Committee meeting, I think in August, is that right? Sometime in August, to continue that discussion. So your question about what happens to Robersonville, that's what we're trying to address through the committee, and we'll be bringing it to the authority for consideration for going forward as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
And you'll see in a future slide, there was one wastewater project, similar situation, Eureka. Get to that in a minute. Switching gears, wastewater projects, 25 projects included in the funding scenario, amounts shown on the slide. Additional principal forgiveness over the $500,000 cap provided to 2 projects, Farmville and Enfield. 1.5, 50% eligibility for Farmville. They went up to 1.5 million principal forgiveness, 1.5 repayable loan. And the remaining principal forgiveness, there must be either 75 or 100% eligibility. For Enfield, 4.88 million principal forgiveness, 2.47 repayable loan. Projects of note, the Neuse River Water and Sewer Authority was the highest scoring wastewater project this round, 85. That's a tremendously high prioritization project. They were bypassed because they're not eligible for the minimum principal forgiveness grant that they requested. Cape Fear Public Utility Authority is in the funding scenario to be awarded $35 million of loan. That's another huge project, $207 million unfunded. Believe that's a PFAS project as well. So we're likely to see that project more in future rounds. The town of Hobgood is a stormwater quality improvement application. A number of projects were bypassed in order to fund Hobgood so that we could meet our green project reserve. A few other projects of note, town of Nashville has 2 projects to extend services to homes. Both are in the funding range for principal forgiveness or grant funds. I think they're identified to receive principal forgiveness. Though that principal forgiveness would be contingent on the communities not charging development fees, connection fees to those homes. That's part of the application requirements for those to get those prioritization points. Town of Farmville has a reclaimed water line project, also within the funding range. And similarly, that if they accept the funds and are awarded funds, that project would include a condition that the reclaimed water, they must provide an agreement to use the reclaimed water prior to those plans and specs being approved and going out to awards. 47 of the 136 applications were from distressed systems, 35%. 9 of the 25 potentially funded projects are distressed. 36%, so similar ratio. That next bullet is for drinking water, not for wastewater. The appropriate bullet is the last one. There's one application from a D1 unit under LGC control. That's Eureka. Staff is working closely with LGC staff with Eureka to try to find some solutions for them.
That was the reconsideration last funding round, right? It was not a new application.
Thank you. Yes, reconsideration. And with that, open up to questions or other ideas for funding scenarios.
The town of Nashville, they want to take 19 homes off the septic. Are those failing septic?
I'd have to look if it would either be homes in a disadvantaged area or they have the documentation that they're failing. Either can qualify for prioritization. It's almost for sure in a disadvantaged area.
Both were. Double check.
Yeah. Nashville. Either one, there's two of them.
Again, I would point out Leela's point from the past, which is it would be cheaper for Nashville to maintain those septic tanks if they're not failing than to put in sewer to accommodate them. Because Leila likes to look at alternative strategies.
So does Bernadette.
Yeah, I think unfortunately the influx of funding was faster than our efforts to try to integrate decentralized solutions into our planning.
But it doesn't mean we don't think about them.
Correct.
Other questions? And I double check the Cape Fear application is from the wastewater side is not addressing emerging contaminants. On the drinking water side, 6 of the projects that are in the funding range are addressing emerging contaminants along with other things that they're doing. But 6 out of the 9, I think we have 9 that's being recommended have emerging contaminants on the drinking water side.
Thank you, Shadi.
Other questions? I appreciate the discussion on the principal forgiveness and the big projects. And the Cape Fear is another example of one of those big projects. I mean, John talked about Fuquay and Stanford and talked about Rocky Point. Cape Fear submitted their application for $200 and something million for their wastewater replacement project. And they're maxed out in this funding rounds, up to 35 million if they get awarded. But that's an example of a large project that will potentially be coming back again for more funding, we think. Any other questions or discussion?
I think that, so maybe a distinction, which we don't necessarily have the ability to know, or back to Melanie's question about that, I would guess Cape Fear Public Utility Authority might not be waiting to start the project on all this funding. They're just juggling their funding sources.
At this point, we don't know that, but that is a possibility.
I'm just guessing based on the size of the utility.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd know more once we get into discussions with them to see what their plans are for their projects, their timelines.
But we also have to acknowledge what they've spent on their water treatment facilities. We heard from them. They've spent a lot of money to deal with PFAS. So might be not that they have as much money laying around for the wastewater project as they might normally if they weren't spending or didn't spend as much as they did on their water treatment facilities.
Right, but they could pretty easily get revenue bonds. They just would not be as favorable financing as SRF. And I'm just saying that based on Carrie's experience when we were building our big new wastewater plant and we got some SRF funding, but we were not slowing the project down. We were just trying to get the best funding we could.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah, and that's, so Cape Fear, of course, can apply, so can other utilities. That's part of the reason why there's limitations on eligibility for principal forgiveness. So that principal forgiveness is directed to those communities that need that additional assistance the most. But everybody who's eligible to apply is eligible to apply. And yeah, we can't comment on whether or not Cape Fear has debt capacity available, to take on revenue bonds.
Right. And I know I'm speculating, but I guess what I'm getting at is I think, like we always end up talking about, there are some other medium-sized communities that don't have other financing options available.
Right.
And that's where, as we look towards the viability of utilities, our funding decisions affect the viability of some utilities much, much more than others. And I would feel relatively comfortable saying the largest utilities in the state are not the ones that our funding decisions impact.
Well, that could be addressed with changes to the priority rating system as well. We already prioritize smaller systems, they get additional points.
Right,
distress
right.
points, or they get elevated. But if there's any, based on the information that we're seeing, who's scoring well, if there are some recommendations from the authority to change the rating systems, that's the time to try to address it. I think that's the way to address it, is through the rating system. We've had multiple discussions, I think on the affordability criteria as well, but that we're talking about it tomorrow as well.
Could I ask in future in the spreadsheets, when it's only a few new additional connections, what might be good candidates for keeping it decentralized and septic system, that we know whether it's really what it really is, so that we know that the funding, when people put in projects, they know they can get funding for sewer connections, as opposed to the funding that we talked about for decentralized systems where there's a potential candidate for next year, so that we could flag that and perhaps address that and consider that.
Gotcha. Like that somewhere in the notes, for instance, to
Yeah,
see
right,
when
well,
they're seeing
see
it.
that there's, okay, 19 connections, what are they, what for?
Whether it's failing or if it's to serve a designated
Right,
area.
I mean, that's
particular.
one thing.
Yeah.
It's different from just saying, okay, well, now we want to connect you to water and sewer.
Gotcha. Other questions or comments?
So here's, typically we would
Yeah.
take a break now. The slide that is shown is the potential funding scenario with all the different projects listed out to help the authority see that and to look at your spreadsheets. Typically we would show this, take a break, and then come back and staff would make recommendations.
I'd
Look exactly like what's shown on the screen.
still like to recommend that we do take a break before we take action on voting for this, in case the authority members have any additional scenarios or anything they want to run through. So be thinking about that. But I just wanted to confirm with John that nothing, so the funding scenario and the preliminary staff reports that were shared with the authority members a couple of weeks ago, nothing has changed from that in preliminary. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. So just wanted to confirm that with everybody. So yeah, I think that if there are additional scenarios or additional questions that you'd like staff to consider or to prepare during lunch break, please propose it now, but my suggestion, if that's okay with everybody here, is that we break early for lunch, come back early, and carry on the agenda as scheduled. So we take action on these after lunch break. Are there any scenarios or any questions that you would like staff to consider or? And then you'll have time as well, so we don't have to immediately jump into action as soon as we get back from lunch. You can have follow-up. If you have questions that percolate during lunchtime, you come back and ask those questions then. Melody, Johan, Leela, that work well with you as well?
Yes.
Yes, I'm fine with that.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so I think on the agenda, we had scheduled an hour and a half lunch, 90 minutes. I think let's keep that hour and a half. So that would bring us to,
1 o'clock.
you want to start at 1 o'clock? It'll be a little bit less than an hour and a half. We'll aim for 1 o'clock restart. So yeah, if you do have any questions for staff, just think about them and we'll come back and go into agenda item H. And we are adjourned until 1 o'clock. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are resuming our meeting. Leela, Johan, and Melody, can we just do a quick sound check? Make sure you can hear us and we can hear you.
I'm here. This
Good
is Leela.
afternoon.
Okay, yes, thank you. That all came clearly. Sound check complete. Thank you.
You hear Johan?
Yeah, and
Johan
Johan's
is
on.
here.
Johan is
Can you-
also here. Yes, we heard you, Johan. Thank you. Okay, so we're resuming. Appreciate everybody's patience and allowing us an extra 10 minutes. So now we're resuming the agenda with agenda item H. Looking at this is the action item following on the previous agenda item, and John will present the funding scenarios.
All right, thank you, Shadi. Pretty short presentation. So this was the last slide of the previous presentation, but really the idea was to give authority members some time to think about the information that was provided as the summary and funding scenario examples, and to see if you had any additional questions or other scenarios that you might want to see. And if there aren't, then I'll make staff's recommendations.
Any questions or other scenarios you'd like to see?
All right, then staff's recommendations are to fund drinking water projects 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, as shown in the staff report and funding spreadsheets that were provided. And for wastewater projects, to fund projects 1, 3 through 7, 9 through 11, 14, 16, 21, 24 through 28, 30, 31, 33 through 37, and project 99.
So that's the staff recommendation. And that includes at least one that was partially funded. Is that right? Just kind of following on how Colleen presented. Were any of these partially funded? No, these were all fully funded.
There was a number of projects that were not fully funded. We went over that in the presentation.
That's right.
3 in particular we called out in the drinking water side. I'm not sure if actually if there might have been one Cape Fear on the wastewater.
And they're all in this list of projects.
Yes.
Okay. We're not breaking them up into partial versus full. All right. So that's the staff recommendation, is to fund those projects as presented in the staff reports and the spreadsheets. Do we have a motion?
I'm happy to make a motion to fund projects as presented.
Thank you, Maria. So the motion's to fund the projects as presented. Do we have a second?
Second.
Bernadette seconds. Any further discussion? Okay, let's go online first for the votes. Leela,
Aye.
thank you. Johan,
Aye.
Melody,
Aye.
thank you. Phil, and Bernadette,
Aye.
thank you. All right, motion carries. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Next agenda item, we're switching over to the stormwater, and I things, 2 agenda items, again, back to back, same as last time. First is the information, the second is the action item. And Tony Evans will be presenting. I think you're presenting, right? Not John?
Yeah, Tony, yeah.
Presenting. Thank you, Tony. All right, take it away, Tony.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I've been tasked to do the spring 2023 stormwater LASI local assistance for stormwater infrastructure investment projects. And I'm going to start off with an overview, just to kind of get us acclimated back with stormwater. Again, it was Session Law 2021-180 that established that these are eligibility requirements. Cities and counties or COGs or nonprofits partnering with cities and counties were eligible where they had to document a stormwater quality or quantity issue and demonstrate a significant hardship in raising revenue. The types of grants in this Session Law are construction, including establishing a new stormwater utility, which, if you remember the last in the fall of 2022, we used all of those funds and there was none left. So that left us with planning grants. We had $6.3 million. I'll get into that a little bit later in planning grants, and that's what we're talking about this funding round. Grants limits, I'll talk about that, what the grants will remind you what the grant limits were. Oops. Again, going into the eligibility requirements, documenting stormwater quality or quantity issue. An applicant describes the quantity or quality issue and how the grant will address the issue. Demonstrating a significant hardship. When we were rating these things, they had to either have at least 1 of 5 LGU indicators worse than the state benchmark, or the entity does not meet criterion 1, but has at least 75% construction, not construction cost, it's 75% benefits of disadvantaged area. We got rid of the construction cost thing. I'm not sure why that didn't get updated. I left off construction in the Session Law talking about construction grants because we're not funding any. So I wanted just to remind you of what the planning grants are. They are pretty much research or investigative studies, or I guess you could say pre-construction planning documents like engineering reports and plans and specs is what we're funding this round. Those are the type of projects. The cap, again, is up to $400,000 per applicant per funding round. And if you had a collaborative effort, it was raised to $500,000 per applicant funding round. And this funding round, we didn't have any collaborative efforts. So all the ones that we'll be presenting are the $400,000 cap. We received 33 applications. 3 were incomplete, ineligible applications. 1 was a grant limited eligible application. And so that left us with 30 eligible applications that we received that we reviewed. And due to the funding cap in the fall of 2022 funding round, 5 eligible applications were reconsidered. And on your supplemental spreadsheets, and in our case, it's J1 and J2 agenda items. You'll see all of the project on the project information spreadsheet. You'll see the information on all the eligible projects and the projects that are in the funding round and funding scenario are highlighted in blue, and ineligible applicants are all in the spreadsheet with the orange background. On the funding spreadsheet, projects again in the funding scenario are highlighted in blue, and examples of funding from different sources are provided in blue text. And we only have one source, which is ARPA funding. So looking at the 33 applicants that submitted projects or studies, again, 3 were ineligible, 5 were under reconsideration. That gave us a total of 38. Taking away the 3 ineligible, left us with looking at 35 eligible applications for this funding round. That 35 applications, like John mentioned in an earlier slide, was totaled to be $11,718,900, vying for our $6,354,540 that we brought in from the fall funding round. And in our funding scenario, we were left out of the 35 applicants that were considered. 19 applicants were in the funding range, and 18 of those are fully funded, and 1 partially funded. 1 applicant partially funded to take up that $6.3 million. Projects of note, we had 1 applicant that had, the city of Washington had 2 applications, Simon Creek drainage improvements at $390,000 and Jack Creek pump station automated screens at $365,000. By default, in our funding scenario, we included Simmons Creek drainage improvements because it was a higher dollar amount at $390,000. And but staff recommends that the city of Washington be approved to fund either Jack's Creek pump station automated screens or Simmons Creek drainage improvements project.
They both scored the same in the funding rounds.
They both scored the same, and they were just back to back. So the only difference is the funding amount. So staff recommendations is that the stormwater planning grants project rankings numbers, and this is in your J1 and 2 spreadsheets, 1 through 8, 10 through 12, and 14 through 21. And again, we want to recommend that City of Washington can either fund Simmons Creek or Jacks Creek at their as their choice. Other funding scenarios can be discussed at this time, or any questions that you may have, we can bring them up at this time.
Any questions, Tony?
Just out of curiosity, do you know if the 5 people were not funded in the earlier round got funded this time around?
Yes, 2 of them. Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Tony? All right. This is the last of the LASI funding and the last of the ARPA funding for stormwater. So City of Lenore is the one that's project number 21 will be partially funded as presented by SPIA or by staff, sorry. All right. No discussion. If you want to move on to the recommendation and action item, which I think is a couple slides.
Which is pretty much like John's, just just the same slide I went over. I'll read it over again. Again, we want to recommend staff fund project rankings 1 through 8, 10 through 12, 14 through 21, and allow City of Washington to choose either Simmons Creek or Jacks Creek projects.
All right, so that's the recommendation from staff. Do we have a motion?
Hi, this is Leila. Do we need to potentially also include that in the event that the City of Washington chooses the Simmons Creek project, that the additional funding then go to the city of Lenore.
Yes, so if they choose the Jacks Creek project, which is the lower dollar amount, 365,000, then yeah, that funding would be offered to Lenore to help them get closer to being fully funded. You're welcome to include that as part of the motion. That would be the practice, though.
Okay. All right. I move that we approve the funding for projects as presented by staff.
Thank you, Leela. So that's the motion, is to approve the funding as presented by staff. Leela, can I ask if you're also including, or you want to have a separate motion about giving City of Washington the option to substitute their projects?
No, I would include that based on your clarification that that is inherent in the recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So it's in the motion with that encompassed as part of the practice as well. Do we have a second? Bill seconds, thank you. Any further discussion or questions? Okay, let's go online again for votes. Melody?
Aye.
Thank you, Jahan.
Aye.
Thank you, Maria.
Aye.
Bernadette.
On,
And Bill. Thank you. Motion carries. Thank you so much. Tony, thank you. We'll summarize all the funding at the end of the day. Carry on with the agenda items. But thank you all for helping us conclude spring 2023 funding rounds. Next, we're going to start looking at things going forward. And we're starting off with lead service line, updates on lead service line. We had presented in April and finalized the rating system for April. But there were also additional comments that were provided that were beyond the rating system. So this is going to capture other changes that have been implemented into the intended use plan. John, take it away.
Great, thanks, Shadi. Yeah, and a lot of this is the first time that this information is being provided publicly. We're in the process of updating website information with application forms and guidance and everything to make this a live program. So pretty exciting, pretty cool stuff. All right, lead service line. Just the kind of the basics. You've heard most of this before. The department had an opportunity to apply for and get EPA funds through the bipartisan infrastructure law, lead service line replacement funds. This is similar funds to the emerging contaminants and some other supplemental funds to the SRF program. These are 2022 funds that we're making available across North Carolina. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides funds for the next 5 fiscal years. We know the amount that North Carolina can receive for 2022 and 2023. The intended use plan that we finalized is just for the 2022 funds. We anticipate and hope to apply for the 2023 funds as quickly as we can and to make those funds available as well. So as Shadi mentioned, we have been through a public review period. DWI released the intended use plan for public comment between March 7th and April 7th. Is that right? That doesn't seem right. Is it that long ago?
It
was.
Yeah,
That's
it was right before. Yes.
We have so many public
Yeah.
reviews going on, I'm losing track. As part of that, we took the priority rating system, which is part of the intended use plan, went out for review as well. As part of the April authority meeting, the authority approved that priority rating system. We had received a lot of comments, a lot of really good comments on that program. And during that April meeting, we were not ready to do this presentation and go over a final IUP. That's what we're doing now. And so the intended use plan as submitted to EPA, and which will be on the website soon, will have all of the comments that we received during public review of the intended use plan, including the priority rating system. In your staff reports that you have, we've summarized those comments, highlighting those that resulted in changes to the IUP from when we took it to public review, and other items that we probably wanted to bring up and talk to you So first off, we received a number of comments on just the scheduling of how this program is going to work. Staff communicated to the authority the intent to make these funds available on a more regular basis to get them out more quickly. But we hadn't really defined what's that going to look like and what funding levels would be made available for those different rounds. This table summarizes or shows our intent. The first availability of funds would be awards in the September meeting. Roughly a third of the available funds would be made available. This shows the estimated total amount of funds and then which portion of that would be offered as principal forgiveness. So the idea is to spread it over the next 3 funding rounds, which gives us an opportunity to get more project information on project demand and potentially apply for, get additional lead service line replacement funds from EPA and make those available potentially for the April awards or maybe sooner if we have sufficient demand and can get that IUP in and through the public review process. Also, in the event that the funds are not awarded as shown in the schedule, those funds would continue to carry on to the April award, April meeting, and then any other meetings after that to make sure we can get the funds out. The intent is for the very first awards, the September awards, we had, I have the number here, but during the public review period, we had asked communities to submit solicitation forms for us to get an idea of interest in the program, what types of projects communities had interest in pursuing, dollar amounts, and asked a lot of these communities to provide that information. So the intent is this first round, September 19th, would just consider those communities that provided solicitation forms. They would have an opportunity to make those solicitations a complete application. For example, they weren't required to submit a project resolution. Between now and the awards, they would complete their application, submit their resolution, whatever else we would need to make it eligible for consideration, and bring those projects to the authority for consideration for funding. Then starting at the December meeting, December awards, that would be open to all communities, whether they've provided a solicitation or not, to submit an application and be considered for funding. We have some approximate due dates. I think those all match up with actual Monday through Fridays, days of the week and not on weekends. Notice for the September awards, August 18th date, that would be to complete solicitation forms. We've already reviewed those, so we don't need as much time to re-reviewing and scoring and getting that information ready for the authority. So we've compressed that timeline as much as we feel is reasonable. We will give applicants more time to submit their resolution, potentially to the Friday before that September authority meeting, to complete the application and make it eligible for funding. The other is we've tried to give ourselves about a month prior to the awards to score those projects and get our funding recommendations ready for you all. That's brand new stuff. Some of the other concerns or questions that we received during the public review period, we got comments concerning that there may be insufficient prioritization to the inventory work. You may recall that there's a lead and copper rule revisions requirement that all the water systems has to do an inventory of their service lines prior to November, December 2024.
October.
What?
October 2024.
October 2024. Thank you, Shadi. And the concerns were, or the comments were focused on, hey, the funds really need to be made available to make sure that communities can get their inventory work done in time for that deadline. You may recall there was an adjustment to the priority rating system that you all approved that reduced the prioritization for replacement projects, some 25 to 20 points. In addition, concept in the intended use plan is to reserve 50% of the funds being made available for inventory work. If there's not sufficient demand for a round to meet that 50% reserve, those funds would then be awarded in priority order to replacement projects and find and replace types of projects. Additionally, we intend to use some of the set-aside money, technical assistance, admin money that we can pull off the CAP grant to use to support both our staff and communities, to use some of that fund to directly contract out with service providers to do that inventory work for those communities most financial need. Again, trying to prioritize that inventory work and help communities get it done to meet the lead and copper rule revisions.
Just a status update, we are working on that, the trying to contract out, and that's taking a little bit of time, but we're working towards that right now.
Yeah, thank you. No comments of interest. Received a number of comments about the funding caps, the limits per round for the different types of projects. Mostly, for the most part, those comments were to increase the funding caps to make sure that they can have a better chance to completely fund the projects and get them started more quickly, and not to partially fund the project to delay. We feel that most of these projects are pretty scalable, but yet still wanted to do their best to make sure that sufficient funding is available. So the caps in the IUP, it's an increase up to $5 million for replacing known lead service lines. The find and replace type of projects still remained at $2 million, but we added a caveat to that funding that the inventory work will be limited to $1 million, and that matches to the third type of project, the inventory only project. That cap went from $500,000 to $1 million. And then just a reminder that all of the repayable loan portion of these projects will be 0% interest rate. Some questions and concerns about principal forgiveness, and just wanting to make sure that the limited, that's pretty good, principal forgiveness allowances are going to those communities most in need. There were no changes in the IUP. I wanted to bring this up because staff certainly agree this is an important part of the program. 49% of the CAP grant, so it's just over $42.5 million, will be provided in principal forgiveness. That's a good amount of money. We'll use the existing affordability criteria as well as the disadvantaged area concept to see who's eligible for principal forgiveness and make recommendations accordingly. Little side note on disadvantaged area. If the project is supporting a disadvantaged area, we're considering all of these lead projects to be beneficial. So there's no documentation required for that. Just show us that it's in a disadvantaged area and you'll be eligible for consideration. The rest of it's all the same as it is for the other programs. $500,000 cap for principal forgiveness, but you can exceed it if funds principal forgiveness goals have not been met. All right. So the division has opened up application period for lead service line replacements. I mentioned the rounds. First one would be the first awards would be in September 2023. Those would only be open to those communities that submitted a solicitation form through today. The December 2023 awards will be open to all applicants, and that would be the second round of applications. Those would be due, complete applications will be due November 1st. Pretty excited about that. Those communities that submitted a solicitation form will be reaching out to every one of those individually to help them take their solicitation form and that information provided. Give them an opportunity to update it with the changes that have been made in the IUP, adjustments because of the funding caps, or anything else that better meets their application and community needs. Get the resolutions, any other signatures that they may need to complete that application to meet the new deadlines. Application training starts in 2 weeks. We will include a portion of the training specific for lead service line replacements. We did that the previous funding round, but it was all conceptual. Now we'll have more details and be able to kind of hit the ground running and do training on this program immediately. I'm gonna look at Kathy here from across the table for me. The last slide says information on the lead service line funding program can be found on the website. I don't think is it there?
We're actually looking.
Oh, okay. Working on it right now. So the solicitation information is going to go away. It's all going to change to application. The due dates, the application dates, that'll all be on the website. And we will be accepting applications using the similar electronic portal that we use the last 2 rounds now for regular programs. It'll be a separate link with very streamlined requirements to submit your application. I'm going to go back to this slide because I think this is where you may have questions, but pretty excited about this new program and would love to hear what questions you have.
Quickly acknowledge the work of staff to try to get this figured out and come up with a new funding program. It's been a phased approach, and I think we're excited to have it at this stage now. Any questions or discussion on the lead service line funding program? We'll make sure that the authority numbers are, yeah, you have all the details that you need. Seeing noddings of heads, but no questions. Anybody online with any questions? Okay.
Well, I'll take a minute and just thank all the public that provided comments for this program, and then just for the priority rating systems in general. Those comments are invaluable, especially when you're creating a program like this from scratch. We very much appreciate the time it takes to submit those comments and do our best to consider them. But we consider them. Can't always accept all those comments and questions and incorporate them in. We do consider all.
And encouraging anybody with the public that's listening, if you're interested in that funding, be on the lookout for those application forms and start submitting them in. And come to the application trainings in 2 weeks. So shameless plug. All right. Thank you, John. So unless we have any comments, any last minute comments on this, we can move on to the next agenda item. Switching gears a little bit away from funding and more on the viable utilities program. And so we're this time of year where we are reassessing all the local governments for designations as distressed. And Susan Kobaki is going to be presenting this agenda item. This is an action item, right? This is the one where.
Yes, there will be an action item.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's hard for me to believe that we're on our 3rd round of assessment under this program, but we are. So a little bit of background history. In the fall of 2020, the authority and the local government commission approved the identification criteria and assessment criteria that we use to evaluate local government units and identify distressed local government units. In the spring of 2021, we did our first round of local government units being designated as distressed, and then some were placed on hold for future review at that time. So that was kind of our first assessment round and how that worked. Then in the spring and summer of 2022, we did our second assessment round. As part of that round, we approved a 2-year cycle for identification and notification of potentially distressed local government units. So that's the process where the first time that a unit exceeds the designation thresholds, they get a notification letter. It gives them options to either request designation right away if they'd like to go ahead and get into the program, or they can submit information if they think that our scoring is incorrect or our data is incorrect, or there's some other circumstances about their unit that they think we should be aware of. They can submit additional information, or they can simply wait another year and see what their score looks like the next year. If they score above the threshold for the 2nd consecutive year, then we automatically recommend them for designation. So that's the process that we approved and started last year. We had we had designated those on hold units from the first assessment that we did in 2021 using that 2-year process. So the ones that had been put on hold, we looked at them again when their scores were above those thresholds. We went ahead and designated them. For the 2-year late audits, the LGC takes the lead designating those. So we identify who has 2 years of late audits, and the authority has agreed in our previous rounds to just automatically go with whatever designations the local government commission did. In the past, all of those units that have been identified with 2 years of late audits were designated by the local government commission. We'll talk about this a little bit more on a future slide, but they may be changing the way that they do that going forward. So right now, after the assessments that we've done in the past, we have 131 distressed local government units. The numbers shift a little bit if you go back and look at exactly who we designated before and what those numbers are. The numbers have shifted a little bit based on a couple of units that got designated and then no longer have active water or wastewater sewer systems, so they've dropped out of our count. We have not actually undesignated anybody yet based on completion of all of the requirements they're supposed to do. So that's still a future process to work through, but that's why if you see that number and it looks off, if you've kept track of the math, that's why. So that brings us to this year and what we've done in 2023. We looked at the assessment data that we have. We're still using the same process. I think when we started all of this process up, most of us felt like we wanted to let the process that we agreed on with the identification criteria and the parameters that we're using run for several years without making any big changes, and then just see what does the data look like. So we're still using the same process, but we pulled in updated data from the financial audits that are submitted to the local government commission. We put in updated rate information that we work with the Environmental Finance Center to get that. We got some updated compliance information from Water Resources, and we used the same affordability data that we use in our applications and with other programs in the division, and updated that data as well based on the latest census information we have. Again, the actual process that we're using is the same. The parameters that we're using are all the same. So just updating data. We also spent a good bit of time refining our master list. What we had kind of noticed in doing the previous rounds is that we were pulling in some units that we would later find out aren't active anymore. There were some small units out there that, based on the way their audit data was getting put into LGC's database, it wasn't getting pulled out to get into our list of units. So we did a lot of work to sort that out and feel like we have a pretty good list now, and we're currently at 494 local government units are in our database that we've assessed. We also implemented some additional QA and QC procedures. Again, this is an evolving program, and as we've gotten more staff and finalized what we're doing, we're pulling in more staff to help work on the data assessment, and then also getting some staff from the local government commission to review all of the data as well. So we think we've improved our quality control a good bit. We've had a lot of people reviewing the data to make sure that it's all accurate. So where did we end up? With our results, we have 6 local government units that are not already designated distressed and that still have late audits for the 2nd year in a row. So these are the ones that the local government commission staff will review. As I mentioned before, in previous years, these all just automatically got designated. They would present them at their meetings and designate them. And I know the LGC staff is now deciding to take a look at these. The requirements in our identification process gives them the flexibility that they can designate, they don't have to. And so I think they're going to be looking at that before their meeting is August 1st, I believe. And they're going to be looking at the specific units, what other information they have about these units, and figure out, does it actually make sense to designate them? So we will follow their lead. That's been the process in the past, again, is that the authority doesn't come back and vote on these designations. They've just followed what the local government commission does. And once those designations are done, they're designated officially. As far as the scoring results for the what we call the D3, where the units get designated based on their score, we had 8 local government units that had been identified last year as exceeding the thresholds, and they got their notice letters last year, and they did not elect to be designated at that time. So when they scored above the threshold again this time, they become automatically recommended for designation based on their score. So you'll see those units on the screen. It's Denton, Grover, Harmony, Hobgood, McDowell County, Parkton, Polkton, and Princeton. So those are going to be, when we get to the action item, that's the first group of units that staff are recommending be designated. And that's, again, based on 2 years of exceeding those thresholds. The next set that we identified are 25 local government units that exceeded the thresholds for the first time this year. So they got the notification letters that gave them those options of requesting designation now, or waiting and seeing what their score looks like next year, or submitting additional information for consideration or updating our data. In fact, through this process, we had one unit that noticed that their rate information was incorrect. So we were really glad to get that feedback from them to see that they were actually looking at the letter, and we were able to get both our database and EFC's rate database updated with that information. I had conversations with a lot of units, and some want to go ahead and get designated, some don't. They have different reasons for doing that. We went out to meetings at a couple of units as well to speak with their boards and explain the process and what's involved. And the end result is that 6 went ahead and requested designation now. The slide shows pending receipt of resolution for Northampton County. We did get the resolution last night, so they are good to move forward if you all designate them. So that, again, will be in the action item to designate these 6 units. And these are, again, first year exceedances that requested designation and submitted resolutions from their board, agreeing to all of the requirements of the program and moving forward as distressed in the viable utility program. Questions on any of these so far? Okay. So the next slide, I wanted to take a look at what the data looks like as we're, again, on our 3rd year of doing this. Where do we stand now? So this was just a quick chart I wanted to put together that shows, out of the total 494 units that we have, where are they falling? And so we have about 27% of those units that have currently been designated as distressed. We've got a handful of others that are in that limbo of their 2-year late audits, and local government commission will be making decisions about those, or they are on the list that we just looked at, so they haven't been designated yet, but we're recommending that they get designated. And then 69% of the local government units in our assessment that have not scored above the thresholds or have not had their late audits, so they're just in there as regular units being modified. It was interesting to me when I looked at it this way. It was a little bit higher percentage than I think I expected to see as being distressed. And so I think one of the things we want to think about as we go forward, now that we have our 3 years of data, and on a future slide of next steps, is start thinking about, are we capturing the units that we thought we wanted to get when we established the program? Is there anything different that we need to be doing to pull in more units, pull in fewer units? But it's a good time to start thinking about that, and probably work with the Viable Utility Committee and start really diving into the data, what it looks like, and talk about what we might want to change. And then the next slide, I didn't do a pretty graph for this, but again, this was just me kind of looking at some of the data that I was interested in seeing on some of these specific parameters that points are scored for, looking at, well, how many of the units are scoring points for that particular parameter versus scoring high enough to get designated. So I took a look first at the smaller local government units. So they score a point in the assessment if they have a service population that's less than 10,000. We have 361 units in our database that score a point for that, meaning they're below that size. And then 28% of those scored at or above the threshold. So that's fairly close to the percentage of designation in our full database. It's not reflected on the slide because I looked at it after doing the slides, but because I was curious, and because John was curious actually, I broke that down and looked at sort of the small of the small systems. And when we go down to the units that have a service population less than 5,000, that becomes 62% of our units, and 30% of those are scoring above the designation thresholds. If we go down to the units that are even smaller, that are the 1,000 service population or smaller, that's 27% of our total set of units, and 37% of those are scoring above the designation threshold. So it is going above that kind of 27% that we saw in the previous slide. But I will say it's actually smaller than I thought that it would be. I thought when we got down to those really small systems that it would actually be a larger percentage of those than it is. So that to me was just something interesting to look at. The next one
Susan, sorry to interrupt, but just to confirm that the 100, you say 28%, 28% is the 100 out of the 361,
Yeah,
right?
Yes, 28% of those small.
All the small
units.
systems
Yes.
are designated or scored.
Bring above those thresholds. Yeah, I didn't want to try to get into the math of distress based on D2 or something else. So I was just looking at, this is their score in the current 2023 assessment.
Great, thank you.
Right. So the next one I looked at was revenue outlook. And I picked that one because that is our 1 4-point item in our criteria. You know, most of the parameters are 1 point each, and we have a few that are higher. This is a 4-point one. So I really wanted to see what the impact there is. And so you can see that 13% of our data set are scoring that point. 82% of those end up with their total score high enough to exceed the thresholds. And again, the revenue outlook is the parameter that looks at if the system has a declining population and their rates are higher than the bar we set for high rates, they score those points. The thought process being, if you're losing population, your rates are already high, so it's hard to make them even higher. You don't really have much of an ability to generate revenue. So that was an interesting look at that parameter. And then the next one I picked was the affordability. And again, units will score those points if they exceed the state benchmarks on 4 or 5 of our parameters. So 47, about half of the systems in our data set do score points for that, and 36% of those score at or above the threshold. So just a few examples, but again, moving forward, I think there's probably a lot of data that we'll be interested in looking at and seeing, are we doing our points correctly? Do we want to change? And we'd love to get your feedback and thoughts as we move forward over the next few months, if there's specific things that you're interested in having us look at and present to you as we consider what we do next. So that brings us to next steps. As far as the actual designation, the local government commission will meet in August. They will be given the same recommendations that we're giving you all as far as the first year notices that requested designation and those that exceeded for the second year in a row. And then they will also act as they decide on those 2-year late audits. So you all will make your decisions today. They will make their decisions. Once both meetings have happened, that's when the designations are considered final, and we'll send out those letters to any units that have been designated, so they have that official notification that they're designated in the viable utility program. We'll then, as I've been talking about, start looking at the assessment results over the last 3 years and looking at the data, looking at trends, and talking about, is the program working the way we want it to? Do we need to make any changes in the assessment process? Are there different criteria that we want to be including? Are there some that we want to get rid of? We have right now, I think it's 24 or 25 parameters that we're looking at. So again, think about, are these the right things? Do we simplify and have fewer? Is there something we're missing? And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other thing to start talking about is what is going to be the process for removing that designation from systems that have been in our program and have met all of those requirements. I don't think we have any that are there yet, but with some of those units that came in the first round, they're going to be getting there. So we want to have a procedure in place for removing those systems from the designation when that becomes appropriate. That was my last one. Okay, that brings us to staff recommendations. Does anybody have questions before we get into the action item?
I think that's a good idea to have the discussion first before we go into the action items. But any questions or reactions to the list of systems, how they're scoring, everything that Susan just presented? Any surprises? We'll say that
I think there are some surprises in some recognized county units that at least the Department of Commerce has worked with for years on infrastructure projects, with regard to economic development. So I think there is some surprise there, and larger towns, actually. So that's a bit of a surprise. And just the number that we seem to be adding consistently year on year, maybe is not surprising, but is concerning, with regard to the rate with which units are moving into a distressed category. It to me seems that it does connotate that quick action is needed to curb the tide of units moving into distress before that number gets to a point where it becomes even more difficult to provide the kinds of resources that we really need to move them from a situation of distress to viability in whatever capacity that movement should take, whether it's shoring up the existing utility or the plethora of potential options we've discussed over the year with management and consolidation and regionalization. So that would be my point. And then also just to say thank you, that data was really valuable, and I really appreciate you putting it together.
Thank you, Melody. Yeah, I agree with all that. Any reactions or responses to Melody's comments?
Not directly to Melody's, but I guess one of the things that concerns me, I think we raised it at the last meeting, is you look at the applications we had for the water and sewer, and there's a large percentage that were from distressed communities, but yet they don't score well to get funding. And so does that keep, and we don't have that much money for the viable utilities. So it's like, if some of it really needs money, what do we do about that? And that to me is a big disconnect. The second thing I thought about is maybe looking at, because you have here on the spreadsheet, you have everything, you have scores, from for a couple of years now. And so, all the ones that were newly designated, look, their scores in the previous year were lower, obviously, because they went up. But would it be useful at all to just look at patterns of the ones who are not distressed, and to just see if there's something, how much of a movement is there of communities getting more points, from the beginning to now, and saying that's our alert system of what's coming up. Because I guess it seems like, oh my gosh, we already had to start out with a number of distressed communities, and now it's going more and more, and we need to understand a little bit more about that. And I mean, you're talking about looking at the data, and I think that's one thing. It's not looking just at who got distressed, but what are other underlying patterns, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd say, what makes you distressed? What makes you distressed? You know what I'm saying? Is it something real simple? And I'll give you an example. Surrey County is a distressed unit, not because we don't pay our bills or we can't afford to do something. We partnered with a municipality on some water,
Mm-hmm.
and we pay the bill and our rates aren't high enough, so we're designated as a distressed unit. We took care of that this year. We saved ourselves some interest and we paid it off. So we're getting ready to move out of that. So some areas, it's an easy fix. For us, it was an easy fix because we looked at it and said, we're gonna save a lot of money right here by not paying all this interest. And so we had the money to do it. So what designates you, you know what I'm saying, is it something really simple? Or 100 of these really simple fixes, or is it easy to get out of that? Designation.
That's a real good point. And actually, I've had in the back of my mind this thing, and I don't know how you do it, is to say, okay, you have all these distressed communities, is there any way we can kind of put them in different categories of the type of distress that they're in? And the type of distress, the ones that are going to be much more challenging, let's see, prioritize, like, what can we do
Because, you know, we've
to
heard.
help them?
Yeah.
There's like,
Those communities out down east that we've talked about and some
Oh,
others.
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And they can't find a dancing partner. We've been a dancing partner with our municipalities. And we've helped them pay for water lines, or we've helped pay for infrastructure. And we're gonna help another municipality because we built a new jail. We're gonna help them with that. But we've been a dancing partner. And that's kind of what got us in that situation of being distressed. But then you go somewhere else and no one wants to be a dancing partner with these small communities or these small towns. And it's kind of sad. You know, we talk about it when you got 100 people that want to hook on to a sewer system or to water, and that nobody wants to help them. That's kind of sad when you think of it.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I know one thing about having tiers of level, different types of distressed communities, and I don't even know if that's possible because that may be a lot of work. I don't know. I'm just raising it as a theoretical possibility.
Well, when we released the criteria on that first list of who was distressed, the overwhelming comments were, we're being penalized for being small, which is not anything they can do about the population and miles per customer and even the revenue outlook, like that kills you. And so even the utilities that were doing everything that they could, whether it was a rate study or raising rates, or but they're never going to get off the list because inherently they're small. So I think it is a distinction between, okay, if they're managing their system, given that at-risk condition, that's one thing versus, versus another. And I think we have to be careful about, the distressed units either getting funding or not getting funding, because some of those projects are Band-Aid projects. They're not solution projects. But it's also like, it's like pushing people to say, like, the Band-Aids aren't going to work. Like, if the regional effort is the answer, or a decentralization is the, like, we think we know what their answer is, because all these other little things aren't going to work. There's going to be, it's a push-pull for a long, it's going to be a push-pull for a long time. But I mean, it's sad and exciting that we have like a third of the utilities in North Carolina that are distressed. We got a lot of work to do, and it's frightening.
And I see Leela has her hand raised. Leela?
Yeah, I think it really feeds into revisiting our master plan and the question of funding priority for distress systems, because it really comes down to still, what are we going to do about it? So I'm always all about data and slicing and dicing and whatever we can learn by looking at the distressed communities, and if there's categories we can put them in. But really that only matters if that means we're going to come up with some different way of dealing with them other than what we're doing now. And right now we're already challenged with, like Maria was saying, some of the Band-Aid projects keep coming through, and they don't score high enough to get funded, even though the LGC is running them. So I think that it just all feeds in together, and we have enough of a history now that maybe we can, it's kind of like taking the next step as to what can the state do given the funding that is available now, and hopefully might be available, some of it be available in the future. Like, where are we headed with all this? So it's interesting. It's a interesting presentation.
So I'm hearing a lot of support for the idea of now that we've got a history of 3 years of assessments, taking a look at the assessments, the trends, the part, can we identify those that are not yet distressed, but maybe in that direction? Are we, are we designating too many, too few? Is it the right assessments? And it's providing it with the resources that are available to help. Because there's one, I mean, there are many different ways you can look at this. We're looking for those that are designated as distressed, regardless of what funding is out there. We just need to identify who they all are, so we help them as much as we can with whatever resources are available. Or it could be a relativistic thing. We know we have this much resources, so let's focus on which are the top X%. We can handle all of that, I think, by taking a look at the data and reassessing it. So I propose that the Viable Utility Committee start talking about that this year, I think, is to look at this and to bring it to the authority to kind of add more input into that. That would be, it's actually, I mean, as Susan put it, is one of the next steps. I think that's very good. It's identified for the next steps in general for SWIA for this year. A couple of answers to a couple of questions that came up. One was how much funding might be available right now for Viable Utilities. We don't have any funding right at the moment for Viable Utilities program because all the ARPA funding that was appropriated has been awarded already. So we have about $1 million left in the original $9 million non-recurring funds. And we know that the emerging operating grants that the local government commission is going to need for those are under fiscal control. We'll need to reserve that money for the emerging operating grants because they couldn't access the other funds. So we don't have UR funds. Now, if the state budget includes funds for the Viable Utilities Reserve, then that changes the options going forward. I'd like to hear, I mean, Melody, if you're willing to comment about any particular towns or counties. You mentioned that some of them are surprising. I'm not sure what by surprising if you mean you're surprised to see them scoring above the threshold and being recommended for designation, or you're surprised that some that aren't on the list, that you expected them to be on the list. So if you wanted to comment on that, I'm giving you the option to, but you don't have to.
Sure, no problem. Not any that I would have expected to see necessarily because I'm not deeply in the know of, exactly what's going on in terms of all the utilities in the state. But looking at McDowell County, for example, McDowell County, while it is a rural county, has traditionally in the past been very successful in terms of economic development, in attracting new and expanding business. So I would not have expected them to show up on the list as a distressed unit. Not saying they operate, at Wake County's level, but certainly they operate in a very sophisticated manner in terms of economic development. Also, the town of Benson, I would not have expected to see Benson on the list. Simply, bedroom community really of Raleigh. Again, some pretty sophisticated economic development projects going on there. And so, those were the two that I saw that were a bit surprising to me based on what I know and what I've seen in terms of economic development in those areas.
All right, thank you. This is helpful so that as we're doing those kind of taking a look at our assessment scores, those are the types of systems that we can use to check how they're scoring, why they're scoring the way they are. Economic development is not one of the metrics in our system. I mean, the high rates,
That'd be
small
like
population.
McDowell, if they were helping to get water to a certain area, they might fall in a category like Surrey did. They've helped, water rates aren't high enough based on the interest that they're paying on the loan. It could be something as simple as that.
Yeah.
But simple as distress, you could be interested to see if that was the case.
And Bill, your comments, kind of the idea that there's maybe some simple fixes for some of those systems, kind of for me, puts in line with what Bernadette's talking about, different tiers of distress, and there may be different fixes, and that's part of the VU program's effort is to try to figure out what should those systems be doing, and there may be small fixes, or maybe some different levels of distress, but once you're designated, the statutory requirements apply to you regardless of what level you're in. But it may be that different kinds of resources are directed at different types of distress systems. So I like the idea that you both brought up to kind of think about that.
And I just want to add a thought to that, because I think that is where there's going to be some systems like Bill mentioned, where maybe it is kind of an easy fix, and maybe they don't even necessarily need help to do that fix. It's just a matter of, by being identified distress, sort of the process has started and there's sort of a wake up call and people start looking more closely. But then we know there's systems that are going to take, well, that have already taken a huge amount of investigation and resources, and we still don't know the answer. And they're still on the list and they're still not being funded. And to me, that wide gap is like, that to me is sort of the, where are we going to go from here part? And, you know, I mean, I'm going to go back, you know, it's the poster child, Eureka.
Yep.
We've been talking about it for 10 years since the authority formed. We still don't know the answer, or we think we know the answer, but it's not happening. So there's some that are very, very complex, and there's some that are not very complex. And so it's not even necessarily the reason why they're distressed, but it's sort of what are all the factors that are going into it not becoming undistressed, if that makes any sense.
Yes, so yes, and that's, I think Susan might have touched on that, but when we're looking at the assessment scoring, it's also the question of when do we de-designate, undesignate? I'm not sure what the word is.
Right.
How to de-designate systems, and that might be something that, you know, ties into what you were saying, Leela. Eureka specifically, we are, just as a quick update, I don't want to go on a tangent, we are meeting with the local government commission. We have been meeting with the local government commission to talk specifically about Eureka. There have been some movements, but I'm going to defer to others to give any updates on that if there are any updates. But so expect more discussions on Eureka later in other SWIA meetings. But yes, the idea of, you know, the different tiers and different levels, different resources, and then the hardest part is right now we've got 131 distressed units, and we're, you know, recommending adding more based on the 2-year scoring and the requests for designation. All of them apply for funding. We won't have funding for all of them. So there are going to be distress systems that are applying for very important projects, and still won't have enough funding for all of them. So that does go back to the whole resources versus designations. How are we going to be able to help every single distress system? Or yeah, what should we be thinking about? So I think these are all questions for this coming year with the Viability Utilities Committee and with SWIA to be thinking about this, and with the local government commission. So we can't say this enough. We constantly are meeting with local commission staff, and we're talking about these things, same issues. So it's going to be a partnership with them as well to try to figure this out. I'm sorry Sharon is not in here to hear all of this, but hopefully she would say the same thing.
Right, and then to just make sure that we add Leela's point, that we make sure that we're funding the right projects, not Band-Aid projects, not, you know, kind of lowest hanging fruit, you know, kind of want versus need. When we do get projects from distressed communities, that we understand that it is a project that has been thoroughly vetted to be a part of a long-term solution versus maybe whatever an engineer came up with. Not, you know, no offense to engineers, but you see what I'm saying.
Yes, and that's an idea that has been discussed, I think, in the committee as well. But the idea that the Viable Utilities Program then becomes, without ARPA, because ARPA had a 2026 expenditure deadline. If we have funds that go in that doesn't have that kind of requirement, then distress utilities or units that are designated distress would go through the whole planning process, working hand in hand with the division, with the LDC, to come up with the right projects, and then they'll be eligible to apply for the funding. That's an idea that's been proposed, something that the committee, I think, needs to discuss further. Melody, I don't know if that captures kind of what you were thinking.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, it does. To Layla's point.
Other comments or questions This is really helpful to have this discussion because that helps kind of set the agenda going forward for this year for the VU program.
And I would just make one more comment. I've done some research lately on population trends. And I think many of you would be extremely surprised at the levels of population decline in especially parts of the Northeast. Many of the communities we're hearing from and talking about, I mean, as much as 30% decline in county population. And at the same time, those same counties that are experiencing population decline are also seeing tremendous increases in older populations. And so when you think about those two things combined, affordability gets even trickier because while your population is declining, what you have left is now elderly and less able to support additional rate increases. And it's really a bit frightening, the level of population decline in especially the Northeast part of the state.
No, great point. And that's the reason that's in the assessment criteria. It's one of those metrics that really are important to capture exactly what you're describing. Now, having said all that, again, those metrics that are being used right now, 25 different metrics, a lot of them are financial stability on the outlook for revenues and for affordability, the kind of population size as well. Those are all metrics that do, as a combination, show potential for being distressed or that they're on the way to being distressed. Plus, we've got the 2-year process where you have to score above a threshold twice in a row before you're designated, unless you're requesting designation, that's a separate thing. So the metrics that we currently have do capture, that's the whole point. They're designed to try to identify which systems are in these conditions. And like I said, Melody, it's not, I mean, it's high number that are seeing population declines as an example. But it's worth taking a look at the metrics going forward to see what more we can learn. Was it just the northeastern side of the state that you've seen, Melody, or are there other places in the state that are also seeing a lot of population declines? Oh, in your communities. Rural North Carolina. Yeah.
Probably that area more than north, but rural North Carolina, we've seen
elsewhere, and yeah.
But I mean, even just looking at Anson County had an 18.2% decrease in population, and the aging population increased by 30% within the aging population share. So, you know, an 18% population decline, and then for the aging population to go up 30% within its share is pretty significant. And other places, Bladenboro. So there is some Southeast too. Bladenboro, 15.9% reduction in population and 43.8% share change in the aging population. So it really isn't just the Northeast, but certainly the eastern part of the state, I think, is a bit more impacted than other areas.
Thank you. Leela, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I know we're diverging, but I think this is all really pertinent to our future work. So Melody, is that from 2020 census data?
Yes.
Okay, so here's just a little example. So I live on the coast. My nephew is a police officer in Emerald Isle. Their 2020 census number didn't change much from the previous numbers, but they either in winter last year or 21-22, they looked at water records for wintertime use, and the year-round population they're estimating went up from something like, I'm going to say 3,600 to 10,000. So the 2020 numbers have not captured the demographic shifts from COVID and being able to work from anywhere. And I think to some extent that's going to show up, maybe not in all rural areas, but just this is my anecdotal reading. You know, people, young people especially, they now have a little more say sometimes in picking where they want to live, as opposed to going to big cities and living where it's expensive. So I just say that to, it's fascinating to me, my one little data point from right near me. But I think we're just going to see a lot of things that aren't going to get captured by the census until 2030.
Right. But what you're going to see is people are going to move to year-round spots with a high quality of life, some amenities,
Yes.
be it natural or, you know, built environment that is, you know, reasonably progressive. So, if you think about some of our distressed communities, many of them, because they're distressed, probably have not reached that level of reinvigoration that
Right.
is required to really attract that group that you're talking about, that is absolutely true,
Right.
are moving from you know, urban areas to rural areas.
Yeah, and I realize a beachfront community is not a an average example. But I guess to me the thing that's astounding, because when he told us that just in passing, because he was looking at, they were looking at it from how many police officers do they need, and they are trying to figure, because they're just having a lot more work and they're way understaffed for that level of people in the wintertime. And so for me, it was just a real eye opener about how much has happened since the 2020 census, that our whole world was turned upside down. And we really don't fully understand all the impacts of that yet.
Good point, Leela. I'm looking at Susan. I don't remember the population trends. Are we looking at the decennial census or are we doing the ACS census? Remember?
Jen might actually have the
ACS.
better answer for
ACS.
that from the affordability stuff.
So if it shows, if population trends of, but ACS is usually American Community Survey, that's usually 2 years behind. So at this point, we're looking at what, 21 American Community Survey. So it's still catching up with all of the post-COVID demographic changes that Leela, I think you're describing. And knowing the ACS data, there's always huge margins of error because they're doing a sampling of population. So it's not a complete census of communities, but it's they estimate what the population is with a margin of error. So it's, yeah, it's tricky getting that up-to-date population data that you're suggesting. Not suggesting, but you're talking about, Leela. I mean, that would be fantastic. It's hard to find that accurately.
Right, and especially in the small communities, because some event can have a much bigger impact than in a larger community. I mean, the larger, like when I was at Cary, obviously the planning department, they did their own estimates all the time based on housing, you know, building permits, and the bigger communities can do a lot of that. But a blip or a new or a development, a new development coming in or a new business coming in can have such a much bigger impact on the smaller communities, or a business leaving or a factory closing, which is one of the things we always talk about.
All right, so coming back to the distressed, well, to the agenda item, talking about those that are being, I guess, what you see on the slide here, list of systems that scored above 2 years in running above the threshold or requested designations. Are there any other questions or discussion about those?
I know you said this, but now it's probably been a while because we've strayed so far from what you started with. So did we get the resolution from Northampton County?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so I would move that we designate the communities as distressed, as listed and recommended by staff.
For both bullet points, Leela?
Yes, both bullet points.
Okay, so we have a motion to designate all 14, is that 14? Local governments that are presented here as distressed. Do we have a second? Bill seconds, thank you. Any discussion? Okay, let's take votes. We'll go online. Leela?
Aye.
Oh, sorry. You made the motion. Thank you. Thanks, Ken. Short-term memory sometimes. Johan,
Aye.
thank you. Melody,
Aye.
thank you. Bernadette
Aye.
and Maria? Bill? All right, motion carries. So those 14 have been designated, and then we now wait on the local government commission to look at those are 2-year lates and audits, right?
Correct, yes, these will go before the local government commission meeting, and then we'll send notification letters after their meeting.
These still need to be approved.
Right.
Yes. Thank you. Just
Right,
for-
yeah,
I mean, I think the authority knows this, but just for clarification, again, the authority has designated these 14 as distressed, but they are not distressed until the local government commission also designates these 14, which hopefully will be taken up in the August 1st
August 1st, I think is
LGC
the date.
meeting. All right, thank you, Susan. Okay, we are ahead of schedule, which is good. We'll be ending early today. I don't think we want to take agenda items from tomorrow into today, so we'll be ending early today. But the last agenda item today is information item, and I don't have slides. This is one that I'll talk about. Just give you, I had some couple of talking points, but just give you kind of a look forward into budgets and funding that might be coming down the line. Some of this ties into some of the presentations you heard earlier. Quick kind of recap. Currently, we're looking at funding coming in from the SRF programs that include the general supplemental. You know this. We talked about how there's bipartisan infrastructure law bill, lead service line funding, as well as emerging contaminants funding. And there's another pot of funding called emerging contaminants for small disadvantaged communities. Those are all known dollars, and those are all we have applied for to get from the federal government. There's going to be total cap grants will be 87 million for lead service line, 44 million for drinking water emerging contaminants, 5.5 million for clean water emerging contaminants, and then the emerging contaminants for small disadvantaged communities. I think it was like 60. I don't have the actual number here. I think it was either 61 or 67 million, one or the other. So those we've applied for, and we're waiting on EPA and federal government to review the applications and to provide those funds. So those are knowns, as well as the next round of SRF funds for fiscal year 23 funds. We're looking at a total of 80.1 million for drinking water cap grants and 57.5 million for clean water. That includes the state matches that we appreciate the General Assembly providing those state matches as well. So those are all known numbers coming in. All right, what's coming down the line? On the state budget is not ready yet, so we don't know yet what's going to be coming down the line for next fiscal year. We're hoping that there'll be funds available for funding programs. If you remember, the House and the Senate both proposed budgets that had one had $2 billion over a 2-year window, and one had 1.5 year over the biennium, 1.5 billion. Sorry. We don't know what the final budget's going to look like. We don't know if that's going to be split up or given specifically to the Viable Utilities Reserve or the local assistance for stormwater infrastructure investments. Lastly, funds, those are the ones that have non-recurring funds, and then we're zeroing them out. I mean, we've already zeroed out the last one today. So we're not sure yet, and we're not sure what the CDBG appropriation amount will be that will come to the infrastructure specifically. All that will be revealed when the state budget is complete. In the meantime, though, we're about to go into applications for the fall round. So the applicants need to know a little bit what's coming down the line. What are they eligible for? What could they apply for? So staff have been preparing now for application trainings. First couple of weeks of August is when application trainings will go, and we'll share the latest information that we've got to the applicants, and we'll let them know that if the state budget passes and we have funds available before the next SWIA meeting where we are awarding funds, which will be February, then we can consider that funding and make award of the funding. So applicants are advised, if they think that they may be funding down the line, to go ahead and submit an application, because we want them to be prepared and to put in their requests, and that we be ready to make those awards going forward. So that's on the state side. On the federal side, Congress is also working on their budget, and a couple of updates. So one thing that did come out first, before I talk about the congressional budget, the drinking water state revolving funds are allotted by EPA every 4 years based on a formula, based on the needs survey. So we do a national needs survey for drinking water infrastructure projects, and EPA takes a look at total needs for every state, for the whole county, calculates the percentage by state, and uses that formula to determine the allotment for each state for a 4-year window. The reallotment happens for the next 4 years, fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 26 allotments. North Carolina's allotment for drinking water dropped from just a little over 3% to 2.76%. Some other states gained. So there's some states that gain, some states that drop. So we're at 2.76% of the national SRF appropriations. So that's one change. On the federal budget side, last week, the House proposed a budget that would significantly cut funds to EPA and to the SRF programs, significant to the base SRF programs, not to the bipartisan infrastructure law, but to the base SRF programs. In addition, congressional directed spending, earmarks, have increased again, and they would take up about 90% of what would be available for SRF programs. Again, this is the House budget. This is not the complete budget. We're waiting to see what comes out of Congress in the end. But I'm calculating, and these are my numbers, nobody else's. It's not official, and EPA is not communicating anything on that, and this is not coming from the federal government. This is me estimating from these numbers that I'm seeing. Should the budget pass as proposed by the House budget, fiscal year 24 cap grant for North Carolina for drinking water will be 1.3 million, and for clean water will be 1.1 million. That's down from about 30 million each program per year. So significant cut. Again, we're waiting to see what comes out of Congress out of all this. This is just the first step right now, but giving you a heads up on what might be down the line. But with the bipartisan infrastructure law, we've got a lot of, again, the general supplemental funds actually exceed our regular base program cap grants. So we have for the next 3 years, in addition to the year that we're applying for right now, we have 3 more years of the bill general supplemental. That would be more than enough to offset these reductions in the short term. But the BIL funds are over, it's a 5-year window. After that, we don't have those funds going forward. Lead service line, emerging contaminants, again, the numbers that we've heard earlier, those are all known for what we're applying for right now. Going forward, the reallotments, we're waiting on EPA to determine the actual final dollar amounts. Any questions on the budgets?
Just to clarify, you said from 30 million to 1 million for SRF?
So the cap grants that so the 30 million is what the state, North Carolina used to get from the cap grants from EPA prior to congressional directed spending. In 2021, congressional directed spending started showing up and our cap grants reduced as a result. In 2022, which is what we had last year, our cap grants reduced by more than half because of congressional directed spending. So we dropped, I think drinking water cap grants for fiscal year 22 was about 13 point something million. What the House is proposing is a significant cut overall to the SRF allotment appropriations and giving 90% of it to the congressional directed spending. So what will be remaining will be about 1.3 million for North Carolina, from what I'm estimating. These are not official numbers. This is just my estimate.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a trend downwards on the base program. So since fiscal year 21 was the one that was before congressional direct spending. 22 and 23 is when we were seeing declines in the base cap grants. And then what's being proposed is much lower. Other questions? All right. With that, I think, can we move up next slide, please? Before we adjourn, I'll give you a summary of the spring 2023 funding awards we all have made, and then we'll be adjourning and resuming again tomorrow. So you all, the authority has reviewed applications for spring 2023 and funded projects 60 projects out of CDBG and the SRF programs and the revolving or the recurring state reserve programs and stormwater planning grants. We had 7 CDBG projects funded, 9 drinking water ones, 25 clean water, and 19 stormwater planning. You all have today awarded $223,019,448 in loans and grants. That's broken down into $27,743,933 in grants, so 27.7 million in grants, $30,060,456 in principal forgiveness, 30 million principal forgiveness, and $165,215,059 in loans, 65 million in loans. So $223 million total loans and grants. Thank you. Sure, everybody who's going to receive these funds will be very happy to do these projects or continue the projects. That does not include the increase to the Johnson County, that agenda item E as well. All right, and with that, we're adjourning for today and we're resuming tomorrow at 9 o'clock. For those who are joining us online, the link for tomorrow is different than today, so make sure that you're using the right link. Thank you all.